Button Press presents Rebel's Oath, Book 2 in the Brothers Cade series, written by Luna M. Rose and read for you by Cynthia Gunderson. Copyright 2026, Button Press. Chapter 1. Talia. The ceiling was wrong. Stone instead of the drywall Talia had stared up at since she was 5. There was no wall next to her bed or string of fairy lights Gracie had helped her hang over the window the weekend she turned 16. Gracie. Talia didn't move. Her body cast in stone as blood rushed in her ears. Silas's voice somehow rang in her head amid the chaos. Inventory first. You can't act and then rewind. Right. Take stock. Her shoulders ached even though whatever lay beneath her was soft. A mattress, not the floor. Her clothes were on, but no shoes. Her limbs were free, and there was no collar at her throat like there had been for Gracie. Not exactly comforting. The hunger clawing at her stomach wasn't a complete void. It had likely been hours, not days, since she last ate. There were stone walls on either side of her, and that triggered the image of a den. A desk. Rain. The sound hit her all at once. A tapping on glass somewhere behind her head. Likely a window she couldn't see from this angle, which meant she wasn't in a dungeon, and it smelled like the sea. That scent yanked the memory of the previous night into her head, crashing over her like a 10-foot wave. The escort north, the drive along the cliffs. Raden Calder. The name sent a shiver through her. What had he said? That he wasn't going to force a bond, but she might beg for it? Rage and disgust flooded her system, giving her the strength to push herself up to sitting. Talia tore off the silky comforter bunched around her legs and stalked to the door. She shivered as her palm hit the cold metal handle, then paused. What would she do once she exited to the hallway? She had no memory of how she'd gotten here or where in the house this room existed. She'd been claimed, but that didn't mean she was a prisoner. He couldn't keep her captive. No matter how much their leaders worshipped the idea of arranged mating, they wouldn't allow for someone to be held against their will. Talia pressed down. Locked. She cursed under her breath and spun, slamming her back against the knotted wood. Monster. Raden Calder was a monster. Talia hadn't even been born when Amos Calder challenged Mikah's father, Gregor Cade, for the high alpha seat. Her pack, with the Cades at the head, was all she knew. She hadn't given the Calder family a second thought, despite the occasional murmur about how things were better before Gregor began to lead. Not an opinion from her parents, obviously. They would have licked any one of the Cades' boots if they were offered. Too late now, since their beloved alpha was dead. Golden light streamed in through the sliver of window not covered by the drapes, and the beauty of it momentarily stunned her. Nothing was allowed to be beautiful right now. Not when she was locked in a room in Raden Calder's hell house. She stormed over and ripped the drapes open, blinking at the intensity of the sunlight. When her eyes adjusted, she peered through the mottled glass into a sea of green. Pine trees, flowering shrubs, vines, and ferns filled her field of view. Beautiful. Talia hissed through her teeth and searched for a latch. Nothing. She spun back, her eyes narrowing to take in her prison cell for the first time. It was large, with high ceilings and intricate molding. The furnishings were simple, but handsome. The bed frame, armoire, and chair in the corner looked to be made of solid wood, and the fabric was plush. She hated it. Find what can be used and what can't. Silas's voice again. Talia scanned the room with new eyes. A ceiling vent, too small for her shoulders, let alone her hips. There was a silver tray on the floor next to the door. How had she not noticed that? She rushed forward and lifted the lid, her mouth watering at the scent of fresh bread and fruit. A roll, butter, strawberry jam, a boiled egg, and cut fruit. She slammed the lid down with a clatter. That was potentially useful, but the vase on the desk was better. Talia walked over and picked it up. It was white ceramic with blue painted flowers. Definitely heavy enough to knock someone out. She'd spent the past few years studying plants, healing, soil composition, the chemical compounds in foxglove and valerian, and how the wrong dosage could stop a heart instead of steadying it. Maybe she should have asked Silas to train her on blunt force trauma. Oversight on her part. A wave of dizziness made her head swim, and she crumpled. Talia sat on the floor. not the bed she'd been forced into by Raden. Had he drugged her? Had she fallen asleep? Choosing where she sat was a small victory. The stone was cold through her jeans, and it took her straight back to hand-to-hand combat training with Silas. They'd used the outbuilding in the field behind the old dairy farm. Close enough to Talia's house, far enough that nobody would hear the cracks and thumps. It was unheated in winter, and the concrete floor bit if you stayed down too long. She'd sit there after sessions, arms shaking, too tired to walk home, while he sat on an upturned crate and pretended not to be exhausted. Tears welled in her eyes. Did Silas know? Did any of them? Her sister, Gracie, was bonded to Mikah Kade now. Safe. Free. That was her whole goal, wasn't it? She sniffed and wiped her nose, then patted her pocket. No phone. Raden Calder had taken her from her home, forced her into his house, locked her in a bedroom that looked like a well-dusted salon from 19th century France, and made sure she wouldn't be able to contact anyone. Fantastic. Talia closed her eyes and reached inward. Her wolf was there, warm and immediate. She nuzzled into her, recognizing her need for comfort. "Thank you," she whispered. Her breathing had barely returned to normal when footsteps sounded on the stone in the hall, growing closer. Talia held her breath, her heart fluttering in her throat, as the handle on the door rattled, then turned. Chapter 2. Talia. The lock released with a click, and the door swung open. In a split second, she knew it wasn't Raden. Her wolf lowered her head, and Talia cringed. She shouldn't have been hoping it was him. More disturbingly, why was she just sitting there? The man who entered was youngish, maybe 30, dark blonde hair cut close to his head, broad shoulders, neutral expression. He wore black because, obviously, villainous households had dress codes. Talia scrambled to her feet, and he crossed to the table and set a new tray down beside the old one. Steam curled beneath the lid, fragrant enough to make her stomach commit further treason. "Where's Raden?" she snapped. She didn't want to see the alpha, but she did want out, and he was the only one she could talk to about that. The man didn't answer as he turned back to the door with the tray of cold food she hadn't touched. Talia narrowed her eyes. "I know you heard me." Still, no answer. If everyone in this house took a vow of silence, someone really should have mentioned that during orientation. He hesitated, then continued on his path. Talia took one furious step after him, then stopped before she did something idiotic. There would be guards. Or something worse. Raden didn't strike her as the kind of alpha who relied on hope as a security strategy. She ripped the lid off the new platter and grabbed the fork sitting on the linen napkin, racing forward as soon as the man slipped through. Maybe she could push the prongs into the gap. Maybe he wouldn't notice that the door hadn't shut completely. Talia held the fork out as the gap closed, then gasped when a hand caught it from the other side. Large. Knuckles scarred. She scurried back, grabbing the vase from the desk and raising it above her head as Raden Calder stepped in. Her wolf stood at attention as the air sucked from the room. He somehow felt larger here in her spacious room than he had in the den. Maybe it was the light? Memory had fractured him into pieces. Size, voice, tattooed forearms. But now he stood whole, his hair loose around his shoulders in heavy waves. He wore a dark shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing the intricate lines of ink curling over muscle and scarred skin. Marks layered over marks, curved like roots around his forearms. His presence filled the room. He didn't need to walk closer to prove he had the power here. He simply possessed it. Her wolf bowed her head, and Talia gritted her teeth. Raden's gaze moved from her face to the vase in her hand. One corner of his mouth lifted. "Planning to redecorate?" Talia tightened her grip, the ceramic slipping against her sweaty palm. His eyes warmed as if she had pleased him somehow. She wanted to throw up. He sighed. "That would be a waste of decent pottery." "I'll try to mourn appropriately." His gaze moved past her to the new tray. "You haven't eaten?" "Nothing escapes you." "I try my best." His calm tone was infuriating. The lack of bite made her want to poke his eyes out with the fork. Where the hell was the fork? Raden took a few steps into the room and bent over, picking up the utensil from the ground where she must have dropped it. Talia's skin pricked. As confident as she was in her training with Silas, he was twice her size. This vase would barely stun him if she could even get close enough. She dropped her arm, but didn't set the vase back on the desk. Holding it in front of her still felt like protection. Raden turned the fork over in his fingers. "Did you sleep?" She barked a laugh. "You know the answer to that." He must have given her something. Otherwise, she'd remember the journey from his office to this bedroom. He frowned, inspecting the tines of the fork. Her jaw clenched. "So, what's the plan? Keep me locked in a room? Until what?" "You know the answer to that." Raden's eyes dragged to hers, and her wolf snapped to attention. Talia's mouth went dry. "Sit." Raden gestured to the bed. "No." His lips twitched. Did he think this was funny? Was he purposely trying to piss her off? "Don't," she hissed. "Don't what?" "Act amused. I'm not here for your entertainment." She crossed her arms over the vase. "Do they know?" Raden folded his arms, the fork still in his hand, and the motion pulled his shirt tight over his shoulders. "Not yet." Panic rose in her like the tide. "If Mikah Kade knew I had his mate's sister in my territory, he would already be at my border." Talia wanted to argue, but couldn't. Raden was right, and Gracie would come even faster. Her throat stung. She forced the feeling down because crying in front of Raden Calder would be more humiliating than watching him lock the door to her prison cell. "You're going to tell them, then?" she asked. "They'll figure it out, once I allow the registry to release the details of your claim." Claim. The word reverberated through her. "You will remain in my territory until the challenge concludes," Raden continued. "You will not be traded. You will not be touched by any male in this territory without your consent." Her wolf stilled, pressing against the inside of her chest. "Sit," she commanded, willing her wolf to ignore whatever game he was playing. Raden's gaze didn't leave her face. "Your plan is flawed." Raden lifted one brow. "Claiming me might get Micah's attention, but that doesn't mean he'll storm the castle. He barely knows me." "Your sister has no say. She's not the alpha." It was a lie. Mikah had always been smitten with Gracie, and now that they were bonded, he'd do whatever she asked. But would she threaten his family line or their pack to bring Talia back? She hoped her sister was smart enough not to give Raden what he wanted. Raden chuckled. "Trust me, she'll have a say." "Are you bonded?" "No." "Then how would you know?" He twirled the fork once, twice. "Your wolf isn't afraid of me." "What does that have to do?" A scene flashed in her head. Raden sinking his teeth into her shoulder, his hand closing around the back of her neck, her mouth. Talia stumbled back, hitting the bed frame. What was that? Something crossed Raden's face. It was there and gone so fast she almost missed it. A fractional tightening around his eyes, a flicker of awareness, like he shocked his finger, turning on a light. When he spoke again, the temperature had dropped in his tone. "The door was locked so I could explain the terms before you had access to the rest of the estate." Talia frowned, trying to make sense of his words. "What?" "You'll have full access." He didn't look at her. His gaze had moved to a point past her shoulder, the wall, the window, anywhere that wasn't her face. "The house, the grounds. My pack members and staff won't interfere with your movements." Was he joking? Why make such a grand display of her captivity if he planned to let her loose? She waited for the rest. The conditions, the list of exceptions, the places where she wasn't allowed, or at least a curfew. Nothing came. She wet her lips. "That's it?" "That's it." So he was an idiot, then. The second she stepped out of this room, she was going to map every exit on the property, charm information out of every wolf willing to give it, and find the fastest route back to Silas. But he had to know that, didn't he? Which meant she was missing something. Talia kept her face neutral. Generous of you." That same flicker in his eyes came and went, and the sweat beading on his forehead glinted in the light as he turned toward the door. Talia's wolf leaned forward, nearly making her lose her balance. "Stop. There's nothing to see here," she hissed internally. Raden was almost to the door when he stopped, one hand on the frame. He didn't turn around. "Your phone." He pulled the device from his pocket and presented it, his head still bowed. Idiot. How had she gotten lucky enough to be claimed by an alpha who was so arrogant that he thought putting her up in a fancy bedroom would be enough to convince her to stay? She crossed the room, pushing her wolf back. The closer she got to Raden, the more she pawed at Talia's consciousness, and reached for it. Her fingers caught the back of his knuckles. Just a graze. And she pulled back with a gasp. His skin was burning. Not warm or even fever warm, burning, like touching a hot stove or a black rock baking in the sun. Raden was through the door before she could process it. Talia stood alone in the center of the room with her phone in her hand and the ghost of heat still on her fingertips. He'd locked her in to explain himself, which was either the truth or the strangest lie she'd ever been handed. He'd given her the run of his estate, which was either a trap or the miscalculation of the decade. She'd seen a vision of Raden Calder's hands on her, and his skin was on fire. What was she missing? Chapter 3. Raden. The corridor was blessedly empty. Raden hurried without obviously rushing in case one of his staff, or worse, his sister, appeared around the corner. He only needed to make it to the stairs, and then 30 feet from Talia's door. His vision tunneled. He stumbled to a stop and put out a hand to catch his fall. The stone wall was cool under his palm. He focused on that. His pulse raced, making him dizzy. It had nothing to do with exertion. He recognized the pressure behind his eyes the same way he recognized weather. It was the animal part of him that had learned over years how thunderheads appeared before the storm. Heat licked up his spine in waves, his skin crackling like static. He hadn't felt this in over a year. The last time had been 14 months ago when the nuclear power plant across the Pacific melted down. Everyone in his inner circle agreed it was an anomaly, and it likely wouldn't happen again. It hadn't. Not until he passed out in the den and Dax had to give Talia something to keep her from remembering. Not until he walked into her room. Raden forced himself to breathe. In through the nose. 4 counts. The way Dax had taught him when he was 16. The headaches were fresh then, and Raden hadn't yet understood what he was dealing with. Out through the mouth. Slow, even. The burn flinched back. Move. He pushed off the wall and shuffled forward. The east wing of the house was stone and old timber built into the cliff face. Raden had walked every corridor of this estate in the months after he first claimed it. He knew which floorboards creaked under pressure and which were sturdy, which doors caught in their frames and which closed clean, where the sightlines from the kitchen crossed the main hall, and which stretch of the upper corridor was visible from the east garden. He knew how to move through this house without being seen. But at the moment, he could barely put one foot in front of the other. If he didn't get to the trees, there would be too much damage for even Dax to explain away. Right at the panel junction, not left toward the stairs. Right, then down the narrow service passage that ran parallel to the formal hall, then onto the landing. The world began to spin, and his skin tightened until it felt like he would split at the seams. The half landing. He crashed into the wall of the narrow hall, his shoulder complaining as he barreled forward and pressed his thumb into the carved wood molding when he reached the end. 3 inches left of the rosette. He held it for a count of 4. The panel released with a sigh, and Raden fell through, yanking the panel closed behind him. Now he didn't have to be quiet. He and Dax were the only living members of their pack who knew this passage existed. It ran along the inside of the cliff for 60 feet before opening up. The old smuggler's exit. A stone shelf above the tree line, screened by the overgrowth that had been allowed to grow unchecked since the estate's last renovation 60 years ago. Raden moved through the dark by feel until he reached the iron-banded door and lifted the latch. Daylight hit him like a sledgehammer. The forest here was old growth, running from the grounds all the way to the cliff edge. He forced his body upright for the 10 paces before he hit the tree line, then broke into a run. He needed to be farther from the house, farther from the guard rotations. 3 minutes. He could hold on for 3. He couldn't hold on for 3 minutes. The burn flashed from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head, not a building wave, but a sudden breach, like the breaking of a dam. His vision blurred, his ears ringing as his wolf lunged forward without any negotiation. He couldn't get his clothes off, couldn't. The shift exploded between one breath and the next, shredding his clothes, ripping through muscle and skin, and rearranging his skeleton. Then he was strength and heat and fur, tearing through the trees, gnashing his teeth. Raden sank back, exhausted, as his wolf darted forward under the canopy, the salt smell of the sea melding with pine resin and damp earth. The buzzing in his ears, the pressure behind his eyes, was gone. The heat that had been climbing his spine like a ladder since he'd seen Talia last night was finally cooled. Something was wrong. He didn't know what, and that was going to be a problem. Chapter 4. Talia. Talia opened her phone to find it fully charged. Again, oddly considerate given the circumstances. Had he snooped through her phone? Tried to gather information on Mikah and the Kades? Gracie had sent her 14 messages. The timestamps climbed from last night into this morning, growing more unhinged as hours passed without a response. She had 6 missed calls from Silas and messages that ended with, "I'm going to kill him." Talia grinned. So, they'd figured it out without an official announcement. A little pathetic that, besides a spam message and fee alert, they were the only people who noticed she was gone. But she'd choose Silas over a horde of friends any day. She started to type out a message, but stopped, her throat tightening. What if that was exactly what Raden wanted? What if he expected her to reach out to her family? What if that was all he was waiting for before locking her back up and luring them here? Raden said he wanted the high alpha seat, that he was going to take it from Mikah, but the only way to do that was through a formal challenge, just like Gregor Kade had submitted against his father. Talia lowered her phone and strode to the door. It was, in fact, unlocked, just as Raden had said. She needed more information. Talia slid her phone into her pocket and found her shoes tucked under the armoire. She dug into the food on the tray, only to have a panic attack halfway through her buttermilk biscuit. What if he poisoned it? Maybe that was how he'd gotten her into this room in the first place? She thought about spitting out what was in her mouth, but realized she'd already eaten enough to do herself in. She could make herself throw up, but she didn't feel anything strange. And it was delicious. Talia finished it and gulped down the tea that accompanied breakfast, then rushed out of the room. The corridor stretched empty in both directions. No guards, so she turned left and ran. The house was enormous. She'd understood that by looking at the Cliff estate from the drive, but moving through it made her feel like a mouse in a hedge maze. The ceilings were high and intricately plastered, and the doors were all made of dark wood with iron fixtures. The walls and floors were made of stone that had been worn smooth by generations of feet and trailing hands. Under different circumstances, she could have spent weeks exploring every nook and cranny without coming up for air. She turned into another hallway and met a half stair down into what looked like a conservatory, glass ceiling and greenery. But instead, she took the door to her right. She burst out onto a small patio. Talia sucked in a breath, stopping to peer over the balustrade. There was no way to prepare for the beauty in front of her. The rain from the night before had infused every blade of grass, leaf, and climbing vine, the most vibrant green, saturating them to the point of implausibility, as if someone had turned up the contrast on the world. The lawn ran down from the house in a long sweep toward the tree line, bordered by flower beds that were both organized and wild. Beyond the tree line, through a gap in the canopy, the ocean was visible, and above it all, the sky was doing something extraordinary. Thick clouds backlit by the sun, rays piercing through at angles that made the world look more like heaven than earth. It would have been paradise, if she'd come here by choice. Talia rushed to the stairs and ran. The salt air was clean in her lungs after the closed rooms, and her wolf stirred with it, pleased and restless. She was already orienting, the bone-deep compass pointing her southeast toward her pack. to Colorado. Roughly 1,900 miles, give or take, and her wolf could cover 30 miles in a hard run before she'd need to rest. That math wasn't good, but she didn't need to figure out the whole plan right now. She only needed her next step. Talia jogged until she was deep within the trees, then leaned against an old oak and considered her options. Plane travel was out. Her identification was back at home. Bus was possible. Cash transactions and no ID required for domestic. She had her phone, which contained her digital wallet, and if she could get to a town with a station, she could buy a ticket. Seattle was the obvious hub. She pulled up a map and checked her location. Northwest of Seattle by maybe an hour, if she was reading the terrain right. Talia didn't question it. She would get off this property, find a safe place to buy food, and then call Gracie and Silas. She stripped off her clothes. Shirt first, then jeans, shoes last, everything piled on a route while she figured out how to carry it. Ultimately, she knotted her jeans by the legs and bundled everything inside. It was crude, but it would hold until she... The hair on the back of her neck prickled. She spun, scanning the tree line, her hand flying up to cover herself. Nothing. She breathed, searching, but there was no movement, only a blue jay hopping from branch to branch above her. She needed to get the hell out of this place. Talia closed her eyes and let the shift roll through her. Her center of mass dropped, the wave of energy making her stomach swoop. The forest opened up like a book. Scents and sounds, the wind through pine needles, the rustle of beetles beneath the fallen leaves, and under all of it the slow percussion of her own heartbeat, now steady and enormous. In this form, her shoulders came level with what would have been her human sternum. Her wolf turned to look back at the house, but Talia urged her to ignore whatever she'd felt there. Yes, she needed a pack. Yes, the uncertainty was terrifying. But we won't find what we need here. Her wolf whined, then picked up the bundle. The knotted denim settled between her teeth, unwieldy but manageable. Then she ran. Yes, this was what she needed. The forest was extraordinary at speed. The canopy strobed the morning light. Sun, shadow, then sun again, and the ground was soft from the rain. She ran until the estate was well behind her, until her lungs found their rhythm and her stride settled into the long, ground-eating pace she could hold for hours. She was going home. That wasn't going to solve everything, but at least she'd be able to tell Mikah, Gracie, and Silas what she knew. Their alpha had died, and it wasn't a surprise that other lines would want to challenge. Did Mikah even want the high alpha seat? What would happen to them if he didn't? Silas sure as hell wouldn't take it, but the other brothers? Alec or Varric? She doubted they'd be interested or capable, which left Harlan Voss, Gregor's beta. Anyone would be better than him. Her wolf slowed, and Talia tuned into her body. She still had plenty of energy to run. Her legs had barely been used, but a dull ache grew in her belly. Damn it. She should have eaten more of the food. She should have... Her wolf's ears tilted back. This wasn't nausea. It was too low, too deep. It wasn't a threat response either, though there was a scent. What was it? It was barely there, then gone again. Her stride hitched. She corrected, pushed back into the pace, but her wolf resisted. Keep going, Talia pressed. Her wolf's ears stayed back. She trotted another half a mile, but the feeling only grew. Not pain exactly, more like pressure, like running into the wind or jumping off a climbing wall and being caught by the harness. Her wolf's stride became choppy, reluctant. Hey! Talia pushed at the bond between them. Stay with me. Her wolf whined. The pressure was getting worse. There was something pulling at her, back toward the cliff, back toward the glass and stone, and... No! She ran harder, forced it out of pure will until her wolf collapsed mid-stride. Her front legs folded, her chest hitting the ground, the bundle spilling from her mouth into the damp leaves. Not exhaustion. There was no fatigue in her muscles. Her breathing was fine. Her body had more miles in it. Yet she lay on the forest floor, flanks heaving. It felt like a fishhook sat between her ribs. Her wolf twisted, pointing her nose back in the direction they came, and it was then that she understood. The unlocked door. The shoes placed neatly under the armoire. Full access. given without conditions because conditions weren't necessary. Raden had known. He'd known from the moment he claimed her on paper, before the registry announcement, before the terms, before any of it. He'd known what a claim from an alpha of his strength meant to an Omega's wolf, even with an uncompleted bond. She could go wherever she wished on his estate, because she couldn't escape. Her biology wouldn't let her. Gracie could come, Silas could come by car or plane with a plan that utilized every resource the Kade pack had at its disposal. They could drive as far as they wanted southeast. But her wolf wouldn't make it. She'd end up in this place, on the ground, pointing her nose back toward the alpha. Her wolf was already tethered to him. Talia had been trapped since the moment he said her name in the registry. She just hadn't known it yet. Chapter 5. Raden. The stone was cold against Raden's cheek, and it was the only thing taking his mind off of his muscles, still snapping with such force that his bones creaked. The fire in the hearth across the room, reduced to coals now, threw just enough light to confirm the shapes around him. The desk legs, the chair, the edge of the rug he'd shot for and missed. He huddled there, naked on the floor, his knees drawn up, his arms wrapped around them, shivering. It was always like this after a shift, but his memory never did it justice. All of his strength, all of his size, useless. It was pathetic. You're not dying. It's what Dax had always said, and as a child he didn't believe him. Now he'd been through this enough times to know it was true, even if sometimes he wished it were. This time, though, he had one memory to keep him company. He'd been making his way to the cliff when he saw her, Talia, standing next to a tree, staring off into the distance. He'd watched her from the shadows, downwind. She was reading something on her phone, then took off her clothes, he assumed in preparation for a shift. He was so far gone at that point he couldn't put up any resistance to his wolf staying put. She'd looked up once, sudden and sharp, scanning the tree line, and his wolf held perfectly still. Then, when she shifted, his wolf followed her for half an hour before turning back. Once he was sure she couldn't leave. Once he saw her struggle against his claim. The image of her standing in the trees, her skin freckled with dappled sunlight, her curves soft and smooth. His breathing slowed just thinking about it. And that's when he really started to shake. It wasn't supposed to go like this. The claim had been political. Talia was the sister of Mikah Kade's bonded mate, brought into Calder territory for one purpose. She would bring Mikah to the table. The Calder name would be restored without an outright war. Except, his wolf was not in the mood to cooperate. He'd perked up the second she walked up the steps, and when she glowered at him across from the desk he was now lying under, something inside of him had turned inside out. But he couldn't have this kind of complication. He didn't want it. And he wasn't capable of it. He couldn't afford to be lying on the floor of his study in the aftermath of a shift. He had a territory to hold, a pack that had barely begun to heal, barely trusted him. He could not be compromised. He could not be whatever this was. That meant one thing. He had to stay away from her. He had to keep his wolf away from her. He would keep her safe, provide for her needs, but he wouldn't be in the same room as her unless the proceedings required it. His wolf would adjust. His wolf had adjusted to harder things than that. Raden dragged himself off the floor, covered himself with a throw blanket, and stumbled down the hall to his room. He turned on the shower and stood under the hot water until he stopped shaking. Well, mostly. The fine tremor in his hands persisted, as it always did. After, he stood at the bathroom mirror with a towel wrapped around his waist. His color was wrong, too pale, the skin across his cheekbones tight, the shadows under his eyes like deep bruises. Those would fade as soon as he got some food, and a lot of it. At least healing was something his body knew how to do. He walked back to the den to find Dax sitting by the fire. He'd rebuilt it while Raden was in the shower. He'd also brought a tray with a steak, herbed roasted potatoes, half a loaf of bread, and a small jar of fresh blackberry jam. Dax would never want anyone to make a fuss about his cooking, but it would be deserved. Dax had cooked for his family every day since his father died. There weren't enough words in the English language to express Raden's appreciation. Thank you. He crossed the room, sat down, picked up the knife and fork, and cut into the steak. He put the first bite in his mouth and chewed, relief rushing through him at the taste of salt and fat. How bad? Dax asked. Not, are you all right? Not, what happened? Dax had stopped asking those questions 15 years ago. Floor. Raden barely got the word out through the food in his mouth. Dax's jaw tensed. How long? Long enough. He cut another piece of steak. The meat was perfect, seared hard on the outside, pink bordering on red through the center, the fat rendered and slightly crisp at the edge. I made it back before anyone saw. Dax scoffed. Barely. Raden's heart leaped. Had she returned? Dax gave him a look, and Raden hoped his expression was questioning and not eager. He wasn't hopeful. But it was raining out, and the thought of Talia out in the cold and damp made something itch beneath his skin. She hasn't returned, Dax said, with more than a little judgment. I was talking about Vita. Raden paused, reaching for the bread. Vita wasn't supposed to be here until tomorrow. She went to her rooms. Didn't even ask for you. Raden snorted, tore a piece off the loaf and dragged it through the juice from the steak. He was about to put it in his mouth when his hand twitched, and he dropped the bread in his lap. Dax raised an eyebrow. Don't. Raden picked it up, scowling at the stain on the white towel. She can't stay here. Raden took a bite, then slathered jam over the rest of the bread. It's not optional. You know I'm right. Raden didn't respond to that. He picked up a potato with his fork. Talia had tried to use a fork to jam her door. He'd been holding it. Where did that end up? He tried to change the subject. Did you pan fry or oven roast? You know I'm right. Raden popped the bread into his mouth. She stays. Raden, without her, Mikah Kade has no reason to challenge. I know the plan. Then you know she stays. Dax leaned forward in the chair, forearms on his knees. He lowered his voice. I've watched you go down twice, in your own territory. I know. But you don't seem to understand. Dax leveled his gaze at him. Even if you get the challenge you want, you can't control every variable. The weather, your wolf, it's my best chance. He growled. If the challenge happens here, I have a chance. Dax blew out a breath, running a hand through his hair. We could meet with the council. We've been through this. Raden slammed his hand on the table. I know we've been through this. I'm saying it again because we're sitting here after midnight and you just spent heaven knows how long laid out on a stone floor and that girl is... He stopped himself, gathering his thoughts. She's in your house, staying according to you, and whatever is happening between you and your wolf when she's near is not going to get better with more proximity. So I'm saying it again. The council. We present the evidence of Gregor's corruption, Harlan's manipulation of the registry, all of it. We go through the legitimate... The council hasn't been legitimate since before my father died. There are factions within it that are addicted to the arrangement they have with the human governing bodies, and the money that comes with it, and the power that comes with the money. He picked up his fork again, still starving. They're not interested in pack law. They're interested in what pack law allows them to get away with. We bring our evidence there, and it disappears into a committee. 5 years from now, Harlan is still moving pieces, and Gregor's legacy is still intact, and the Omegas are still collared. Dax's jaw flexed. You know I'm right. I know you believe you're right, which isn't the same thing. I also know that you're sitting in a towel with bruises I can see from here, and your hands haven't been fully steady since you sat down. He paused, lowering his voice. Whatever triggered tonight is going to keep triggering as long as she's under this roof. Raden ate a perfectly roasted potato. I need to stay away from her. Until the challenge is complete. I fight Mikah on my own ground in my own territory, and then what? He chewed and swallowed. Then, after I'm high alpha, I denounce the claim and release her. She goes home. The fire crackled. Dax shook his head. She'll be a pariah. I'll have the seat. I'll have the standing to— To what? Change what other alphas and packs think? Dax leaned back. The firelight moved across the lines of his face, the old ones and the newer ones Raden had put there without meaning to. A rejected mate, Raden. That's what she'll be. In the registry, in the records, in every pack history that references this challenge. You can write protections into law. You cannot write them into their heads. Raden said nothing. She had a life before you brought her here. I know that. A pack. People who— I know that, Dax. He'd known that when he made the decision, and he had made it anyway. Because the alternative was Kade corruption running another decade into the pack system with Harlan Voss headlining the show. Forcing a Kade to challenge him was the only way to end this. All right, Dax said. Not agreement. The word of a man who had made his case and lost. He stood and straightened his jacket. I'll check the rotation. He moved toward the door. Dax. He stopped but didn't turn. She might be fighting it. Might? Raden thought back to the fire in Talia's eyes when she stood across the desk from him. She will be. By now, Talia must have realized she wouldn't be able to leave. He'd thought about warning her, but she wouldn't have believed him anyway. Make sure she gets back. She's not stupid. Just make sure. I will. Thank you. Dax nodded once, then motioned toward the plate. Eat the rest of that. You look like hell. Chapter 6. Talia. Talia came back to herself in pieces. The dark hit first, then the damp and cold. She sat up in a rush and the world tilted. She pressed her palms flat into the leaf litter and waited for her vision to clear. Her feet were bare, as were her legs. She had bare everything. Apparently, she'd fallen asleep and shifted back to her human form, which was unfortunate given the soft patter of rain. At least her bundle of clothes was beside her, the denim pressed against her calf. She grabbed it and dressed. Her jeans were damp, not soaked, but her socks worse than useless. She shoved them into her pocket, found her phone, and put her shoes on. The forest was quiet around her. Just the hiss of drizzle. Her wolf was quiet now. Not the attentive quiet of the first night, not the focused stillness she'd felt in the estate. Depleted. I'm sorry, Talia whispered, mentally stroking her head. Then she gave in and finally texted Gracie and Silas. It was probably the wrong thing to do, probably exactly what Raden expected, but she had no other plan that made sense. So she told them the truth, what she remembered and what she didn't. It was the middle of the night, so she didn't expect a reply. She pushed the phone into her back pocket and stared off into the trees. The direction of the estate was not something she had to think about. It still pulled at her, and there was nothing else left to do but walk. After what seemed like hours, the sound of the ocean came into focus. Talia's hands and feet were numb, but she was close enough to Raden's estate that she felt whole. Her wolf slept peacefully as she turned through the trees and approached the cliff's edge. The crash of waves against rock rose from below, and she wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. She'd had plenty of time to think, and while she didn't understand everything Raden Calder intended, she did know one piece for certain. He would use her to hurt Mikah and Gracie. Her mind ran in circles, trying to find a way out. The clouds had broken enough for a thin ration of moonlight to reach the grass and the jagged rocks, the water below. She walked to within a few feet of the edge and looked down. The drop was long. Maybe that was the answer? If she didn't exist, Raden wouldn't have leverage. She wouldn't be trapped, and her sister wouldn't have to factor her into whatever decisions she and Mikah were making. If she jumped, it would be fast. Easy. Even with her increased healing abilities, if her spine snapped, she wouldn't come back from that. The thought scared her so badly she stumbled back, her heart pounding against her ribs. She dropped to the ground and pressed her hands into the soil. That wasn't the answer. She needed to find another way. Before long, the estate came up through the trees, the warm glow of exterior fixtures bleeding through the fan of branches. It reminded her of the night she'd arrived. Was that only 24 hours ago? Talia stopped at the edge of the grounds and looked up. What choice did she have? Somehow, she'd made it there without falling to pieces. But now with the hope of warmth, of a soft bed, her body revolted. Her mouth tasted like forest floor and her hands were numb. Pressure at the back of her skull threatened to become a full-blown migraine, and she was not going to figure out anything useful in this condition. But the last thing she wanted to do was skulk back up the steps. She would make Raden Calder pay for this. Talia kept to the trees, searching for the door she'd exited through earlier. She found it and was about to cross the lawn when a glint of something in the brush caught her eye. She stepped back, inspecting the ground, then picked it up. Metal? A fork? What was that doing outside in the grass? She put it in her pocket and trudged forward, stumbling up the wide stone steps, then turned the handle. It didn't engage. Talia blinked, then pressed the latch again, harder, like the door might reconsider. It must have had some electronic locking mechanism. The rain was falling harder now, dripping down the back of her neck. She cursed under her breath and stepped back. The grounds were black and gold. The exterior fixtures threw warm pools of light on the dark, slick stone. She hurried across the patio with her arms wrapped around herself and her shoes squelching. The cold had seeped into her bones and it was becoming unbearable. She rounded the corner and wind off the water hit her face, the rain stinging her skin. Talia put her head down and pushed along the wall. A service door, locked. A set of glass doors onto a terrace, locked. The room beyond them dark. She was starting to do the math on broken windows and other forms of breaking and entering when she came around the corner of the east wing and stopped. A light. One window, warm against all that black. Her nostrils flared. The last thing she wanted to do was beg for Raden Calder to open the door for her. But maybe he'd long since gone to bed, and that room belonged to someone else entirely. Talia tried to squeeze her hands into fists and could barely feel her fingers. She had to knock, and if that gave him satisfaction, at least she wouldn't feel it when she punched him in the throat. Chapter 7. Raden. The steak was gone, most of the potatoes, half the bread. It was working the way it always worked. Slowly, from the center outward, his body revitalizing inch by inch. The tremor in his hands had downgraded from constant to intermittent. The fire had burned down to embers, and he'd rallied the energy to put on underwear and a t-shirt. The worst of it had passed. He was, by a generous interpretation of the word, functional. He should have been asleep, but Dax still hadn't sent his report. Raden paced. How was it that he hadn't heard anything? Talia should have returned to the house shortly after he had, and Dax's scent drifted through the door. Raden rushed forward, throwing it open. He read the news off Dax's face before he spoke. Raden, she's not in her room? Raden's vision darkened at the edges. He'd given her free access to the estate, a beautiful room, excellent food, and she couldn't even bother to come back? Rain pelted the windows. His wolf pushed up off the floor of his chest in one motion, fully awake, fully focused, 100 miles from the depleted heap he had been an hour ago. Where is she? Dax jogged after him down the hall. I don't know. We lost track of her scent near the cliffs. Raden growled deep in his throat. Find her. Raden! He whirled, nearly colliding with Dax head on. Find her. She doesn't want to be found. Dax's words hung in the air between them. She's my responsibility, he said, his voice flat. She's in my territory under my claim. If she's face down in the leaf litter, it's on my head. When Dax didn't say anything, Raden dropped into his chair, breathing hard. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. Don't apologize to me. Dax leaned against the wall, bracing himself, but Raden didn't get to hear what he would have said next. A knock on glass made them both jump. Raden ran back, peering through the window of the den. When the face on the other side came into view, all the calm he'd fought for seconds before was sucked from the room. Relief hit first, but fury rode in on its back. Her skin was white, her lips purple, her hair matted to her forehead. His wolf was a wall of sound, and that same snap of static he'd felt earlier in her room sang up his spine. She came back. She came home. He bolted for the door. Raden! Dax had seen her now, too. Raden, I'll let her in. But it was too late. Raden was already turning the handle. Chapter 8. Talia. Where the hell have you been? Raden's growl of a voice came out of the dark to her left. She turned, and Raden was already there, storming down the steps in what looked like underwear and a t-shirt. A second figure lurched after him. The man was tall, but looked dwarfed next to Raden. He had gray hair at his temples, and he looked like he needed a stiff drink. Out, Talia answered. She could barely get the word to leave her lips with how badly she was shivering. Out? Raden stopped 3 feet from her. His eyes dragged over her in one pass, cataloging her soaked shirt, her hair plastered against her neck, the dirt smudged on her skin. His eyes grew darker with each inventoried detail. It's 2 a.m. I can tell time. His jaw worked. Don't act like a child. Then don't treat me like one. Raden opened his mouth, then snapped it closed. His hands whipped out, grasping her arms and lifting her like she was a sack of feathers up to the threshold, sweeping her into the warm hall. She yelped at the heat of his palms and the shock of being literally swept off her feet. Her skin was still buzzing when Raden again asked, Where were you? He waited for his companion to move inside before slamming the door behind him. That's none of your business. Her teeth chattered, a shiver rolling through her spine. Everything in this territory is my business. Raden's chest heaved. Scrolls of dark ink wound over his arms, and she wondered whether they spread across the side of his chest and down his ribs like roots. Drops of rain rolled over his skin, drawing goose flesh, and Talia's mouth went dry. She swallowed, hard. I'm not in your territory. I'm in your hallway, trying to get to a bed, which I would already be doing if your doors weren't locked and you weren't... She gestured at all of him. Blockading. Her wolf rested on her front paws, watching with rapt attention. He is not our alpha, Talia repeated, but her wolf didn't even flinch. This was who she was supposed to follow? A man who was half-dressed, having a hissy fit in the entryway? Raden? The tall man hissed his name under his breath. At least his friend seemed to recognize the ridiculousness of the situation. Raden looked as if he might throw the man through the wall, but instead he drew one deep, slow breath. Thank you, Dax. That will be all. Dax. Talia filed the name away. I'll let you two. She gestured to the two of them and tried to slip past Raden, but his hand came up. Not touching her, just into her path. Flat. A wall materializing. Raden lowered his voice. You're going to get warm, and you're going to eat something. She glowered at him. I'm going to sleep. Your lips are gray. My lips are none of your... You've been out in the rain for upwards of 12 hours, and you haven't eaten since yesterday morning. You will sleep, but not until I see that you're warm, and you have something to eat. It wasn't that his plan was a bad one. Warmth and food sounded delightful. But the fact that he was ordering her around... I'm sorry, I must have missed the part where my circulatory system became a pack matter. Dax let out a sigh, and Raden's mouth twitched. He took a step closer, and the heat from his body made her skin tingle. Here are your options. There's a robe in your armoire. Dry, warm. You put it on, and you meet me in the kitchen, and you eat something hot. That's option 1. And option 2? Another step. He was like a furnace, making every hair on her body stand on end. I carry you there myself, strip off your wet clothes, dress you, then feed you something hot, bite by bite. His dark eyes bored into hers, and everything inside Talia stilled. She could see it. Raden scooping her up into his arms, his heat flooding her body as he delivered her to her bedroom where he'd kneel in front of her, his thumb and forefinger flicking open her buttons, peeling off the soaked fabric, his breath on her stomach, his... Option 1, she snapped, stumbling back and hitting her elbows on the wall. Raden's eyes flared. He watched her, his chest rising and falling with each breath. Very well. Dax, accompany her. I know the way to my room, she said, but Raden was already stalking away from her. Her wolf whined, and Talia forced herself forward before Dax could treat her like a toddler on a leash. "The robe is on the left side of the armoire," Dax said, as they reached her door. "Slippers below it." She stopped with her hand on the handle. Convenient. "He has the staff keep the guest rooms ready." "So, he uses them regularly?" Talia asked, flashing an innocent smile. Dax didn't bite. "I'll wait here." Stripping off her clothes in the bathroom was pure heaven. She ignored the pins and needles of returning circulation to her feet and hands and pulled on the fluffy robe. Thick, soft, charcoal gray, and the slippers fit perfectly. She ran a brush through her hair and twisted it up, securing it with a clip that had magically appeared in her bathroom since she'd left. Dax was waiting in the corridor as promised when she emerged. They walked in silence through the dining room, with its dark-paneled ceilings and the rain streaking the ocean-facing windows. Talia smelled the food before they reached the door. Butter and onions gone soft and sweet, and underneath it something rich and meaty. Her mouth watered. Dax pushed the kitchen door open, and before she could make some comment about them not deserving the quality of their staff, Talia stopped short. Raden was at the range. The alpha of this territory, the man who had claimed her through the registry and who wanted to challenge for the high alpha seat, stood at the 8-burner range still in his underwear, wearing an apron. Chapter 9. Talia. Raden, with one hand stirring something in the pan in front of him, motioned for her to sit at the stools tucked beneath the counter. Talia sat. The kitchen was peaceful and dimly lit. Raden had left the overheads off, and only the low counter strips were lit. Copper pots hung dark over the island, and the stainless steel hood gleamed. Dax stood near the door for a moment, and she had the strangest inkling that he wasn't there to protect her from the big bad alpha, but to protect Raden from her. None of which made any sense. "You can go," Raden said. The door swung shut behind Dax, but Raden didn't turn around. He moved between the range and the counter like he'd done this 1,000 times. He dropped butter into the pan, let it sizzle a moment, then cracked 3 eggs one-handed and whisked them with a fork while the other hand shifted the first pan off the heat. The fork. It was still in her pocket. She pulled it out and set it on the counter, wondering if he'd say anything. He clocked the motion but went right back to his task. "There's tea," he said. A full pot at her end of the island was already steeping. She poured a cup. It was hot and dark and slightly sweet, and her hands wrapped around it, the heat soaking into her palms. She shivered, and, of course, Raden looked up at that exact moment. "Don't. I didn't say anything." "You were about to." His lips twitched. "I was checking the toast." Liar. There was no toast yet. He smirked, wiping his hands on his apron and pulling a wrapped loaf from the bread box. He sliced 2 pieces and bathed them in butter. What he set in front of her, 6 minutes later, was the last thing she'd expected. Soft, folded eggs the pale gold of custard, glossy, scattered with herbs, chives and a little thyme. Fresh, which meant someone had walked outside in the rain at some point for the sake of garnish. The toast was sourdough, fried crisp in the butter. "Eat." Raden turned back to the range to deal with the pan. She meant to eat slowly, with indifference, performing the bare minimum of compliance, but the first bite of eggs dismantled the entire charade. They were perfect. Barely set, rich and seasoned, and her body, which had been running on forest air for half the night, simply took over the operation. She ate the eggs, devoured half the toast, and poured another cup of tea. "Problem?" Raden turned around. He was leaning back against the counter by the range now, arms crossed over the apron. "No." "You stopped." She picked the toast back up. "I'm pacing myself." "You shouldn't." "Don't tell me what I should and shouldn't do, okay? It's the middle of the night and I'm pissed at you, but this food is making it difficult to—" She snapped her mouth closed when Raden slid a jar of fruit preserves with a knife already placed across the counter toward her. "I don't need—" "It's good." She knew it was good. That was the problem. She gave in and spread it on the toast and took a bite, forbidding her body to eye-roll or sigh. "Who makes this?" "Mara, an old friend. The fruit's from the orchard. She nets them in August before the birds take everything." "It's Good jam. I'll tell her. He untied the back of his apron. A compliment under protest. It happened before she could stop it. The breath of a laugh escaping through her nose, and she dropped the jam knife. Talia stared at the smear of dark purple over the counter, then looked up at Raden. His lips were pursed. She shook her head, a warning. How dare he, trying to be funny when he was the entire reason she'd spent half the night sleeping in the underbrush. Making her a midnight snack didn't make up for kidnapping her. Her wolf blew out a breath in what felt like a defense of the cocky alpha in front of her, and it felt like she stepped off a curb without realizing she'd reached the edge of the street. Talia pulled her hands back from the food like she'd been shocked. I'm going to bed. Thank you for the food. She winced. Why was she thanking him? This was the problem with pack hierarchies. An alpha could do whatever the hell he wanted, and if he showed her the tiniest kindness, she was supposed to be grateful. How far did you get? Raden's voice stopped her by the door. She spun. Excuse me? Today, in the woods. How far? That's not your 3 miles. Her nostrils flared. I need to know for your safety. If you're going to keep testing the boundary, I need to know where you drop so my border rotation knows. Aha! So your wolves can collect me at the perimeter like a dog hitting the end of its run? That's not what I meant. That's exactly what it is. Her voice shook. You can make perfect eggs and toast, and it doesn't change what this is. You built the run, Raden. You don't get to act wounded when I cut myself trying to jump over the chain link. His jaw set. I'm trying to keep you from spending another night unconscious on the forest floor. How very noble of you. Talia shook her head and charged into the corridor, heading back the way she'd come with Dax. Footsteps sounded behind her. The tether is the claim. Talia walked faster. Did he think she hadn't figured that out already? I'll drop it after the challenge, but until then, you eating and sleeping and not freezing to death in my woods is my responsibility. He followed her through the dining room and down the hall. She broke into a jog, and Raden growled, A pack is supposed to— I'm not your pack, Talia growled, spinning and knocking into his chest. He caught her waist, and she shoved him hard enough. He stumbled back, eyes widening. Would you ever claim one of your omegas and drop them after you got what you wanted? His jaw tick was enough of an answer, so she continued. Don't pretend you have any concern for me. We both know what this is. I'm your leverage. And I'll tell you right now, I'll do everything I can to make sure you lose any challenge you make against the Kade family. His eyes flickered. Direct hit. Raden stepped back, his breathing uneven and stilted. Then, I guess we both have proper expectations. Yes, we do. He cleared his throat, his eyes dropping to the floor. Was he? Talia sucked in a breath. She'd just challenged Raden Calder, an alpha, and he was lowering his eyes, bowing his head. He took another step back. Good night, Talia. Her stomach swooped, her wolf standing at attention. He was deferring to her, and the shock of it made it impossible to speak. He turned and retreated down the hall. Talia stared after him. His footsteps echoed, and her wolf, traitor to the last, leaned toward the sound until it disappeared. Chapter 10. Talia. She was 6 years old the first time she'd tried this. The bathroom mirror in her parents' house was low enough that she could see herself fully. Her small, serious face, dark eyes, and hair that always had a mind of its own. She'd been told that her wolf was there, waiting inside her, and she wanted to catch a glimpse. Talia stood at that mirror for a long time, perfectly still, staring into her own eyes. She searched for a shape, a shadow, some evidence of the other thing living inside her. She hadn't found it then. Her wolf had been years from waking. Now she stood in front of the mirror in Raden's guest bathroom, large and well lit, and there she was. Her wolf pressed against the front of her awareness like a hand against glass, alert and restless. She needed a distraction, anything to keep her wolf from latching on to Raden's presence more fully. He's not our alpha. Her wolf snorted in disapproval. Gregor was dead, which was why her wolf was doing this. The pack alpha's death had left a hole in the bond structure, a signal gone silent that every wolf in the territory felt. Her wolf was scared seeking stability, and something about Raden was turning up her frequency. The previous night, she'd found fresh clothes on the desk and didn't think too hard about where they'd come from or how they fit her so well. She'd been too cold and too tired to do more than pull on the sleep things and slide into bed. After a long, hot shower that morning, she found her clothes laundered and a new light gray pullover to add to the mix. She'd decided on her strategy, or redecided it, lying in bed as the rain pounded against the windows. She'd eat what they brought her. She'd sleep in the bed. She'd take the clothes Raden offered because she'd need every shred of strength to figure out what to do next. But her indignation kept slipping through her fingers because she was warm. That was the problem. She was warm and comfortable, sitting on her bed with a full stomach. Her wolf was smug and had no intention of letting her forget it. Talia pulled out her phone. She'd been texting with Gracie since she woke, and her sister had sent more messages while she was in the shower. Talia: still here, don't freak out. Gracie: too late. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Gracie: can you fill me in, please? Talia sighed and laid back on the pillows. She'd promised to tell Gracie the whole story after she got some sleep, but how was she supposed to explain this? Well, I made it about a quarter mile past the tree line before my wolf sat down and refused to take another step, and then it started raining and I slept in the woods naked for hours before accepting that I was going to die of hypothermia rather than win any fight against Raden. So I fought with him in the hall, shivering like a stray cat, and then he forced me to eat and cuddle up in his soft guest bed. Very dignified. Talia: I can't leave. He hasn't forced me to stay, and he says he won't make me bond, but my wolf can't break past the claim and his alpha energy. Gracie: what? Talia: yeah. She felt weak admitting that. Her sister could only be held by a collar, and here she was stuck in a house because she couldn't override her wolf. But he had been worried about her. He acted like a controlling ass, but he'd given her food. No, she wasn't going to search for the fraction of a degree where Raden's behavior was technically defensible. He was holding her against her will, and her wolf was already confused enough without her adding nuance. Gracie: adding Silas to this chat. Talia waited while Gracie filled Silas in. After a few mad face emojis and another, "I'm going to kill him," Silas wrote, "Dissolving this claim requires either Raden's voluntary release, a formal council challenge, or proof of coercion severe enough to trigger an emergency review." Talia: proof? What kind of proof? Too bad she hadn't recorded what Raden said to her the previous night. Silas: the council review is still on the table, but I want to be honest with you about the timeline. Probably 4 to 6 weeks, maybe longer. Harlan's lobbying council members, framing any pushback against the registry as entitlement. Well, it wasn't like Raden's move was a secret. Harlan could see the writing on the wall, and so could the Cades. But if Mikah filed a complaint, he'd be shooting himself and his family in the foot. She blew out a frustrated breath. There was no chance Raden would offer a voluntary release after all this, and even if he did, she'd be tainted. Why would an alpha give her up after making a claim? None of the potential reasons were good, since the general pack population didn't understand these family political games. Hell, she wouldn't believe any of it if her own sister hadn't gotten tangled in their web. The edge of that cliff was looking better and better by the minute. Silas: Mikah has to challenge. Talia pressed her thumb against the edge of the phone hard enough to leave a mark. No, that wasn't an option. She texted as much, only to see Gracie responding as fast as she had. Gracie: it's the only way. The pieces clicked into place. Why Raden hadn't challenged yet, even though he admitted his end goal. Talia: Raden wants territorial advantage. Silas: hey, she's finally catching up. Talia sent him a crude emoji and he laughed. But there was nothing funny about this. Raden against Mikah? Mikah didn't hold the high alpha seat, not officially, so could he even issue the challenge before... Gracie: a candidate alpha carries standing. They can initiate or receive a formal challenge and be bound by the outcome. Prevents power vacuums from being filled by default rather than by dominance. Talia read the message 3 times. She probably should have paid more attention to pack law growing up. So, yes, she was the one stuck in Raden Calder's house, but Mikah and Gracie were just as trapped. They were all being funneled toward one end result, but she couldn't let anything happen to Mikah or her sister. Not after what they'd already been through. Gracie. Say something. Talia. I'm thinking. Gracie. That's what worries me. She set the phone on her thigh, drew a deep breath, and considered it rationally. As much as she hated it, Silas and Gracie were right. She'd be happy to sacrifice her own social status to solve this, but Raden wasn't going to give her up. There would be a fight, and it would have to be Mikah. Alec was off at some wellness retreat. Varric was, to put it mildly, not a fighter. And Silas? Talia winced at the hollow ache in her chest that opened up any time she thought of Silas being in danger. He was a brother to her. No. As much as she hated it, Mikah was the only Kade brother who could take the seat. But Mikah couldn't rush in with a challenge. If Raden was smart enough to manipulate this situation, he was smart enough to stack the odds in his favor. He thought he could win under these circumstances, which meant she had to find a way to give Mikah the upper hand. Talia. How long can Mikah wait? Silas. Talia. Talia. I'm not being a martyr. I'm serious. Gracie. You are being a martyr. We're not waiting. Talia ignored that and sent, he could voice public support of the registry. By a couple of weeks? Silas. Hell no. I'm not leaving you there for that long. Talia. I'm safe. Raden forces me to eat and bathe, so he's basically a better version of you. She grinned, imagining Silas's snort of indignation. Silas. Middle finger emoji. Talia. Raden's smart and he has a vendetta. Give me a little time and I can figure out something to help Mikah win. Gracie. 2 days. Talia. 2 weeks. Gracie. 3. Talia. Weeks? Perfect. Gracie. Days. Talia laughed, then realized it was the first time that had happened since her father caught her grabbing her things from the floorboards. 3 days? Was that enough time to accomplish anything? It would have to be. Gracie. Please be careful. Silas. Oh, and also, I'm going to kill him. Talia's eyes pricked. Nothing about her situation had changed, but knowing she wasn't alone in this transformed everything. Gracie and Silas couldn't show up and violate the terms of the registry without a good reason, and so far, Raden hadn't given them one. But they would find something. She just needed to stay sane. There was a plant, Valeriana sitchensis, native to the Pacific Northwest that she'd been studying for its effects on wolf anxiety and omega shifters. Not valerian root in the standard medicinal sense, but the fresh plant. The volatile compounds released when the leaves were bruised. Something in the terpene profile had more of a sedative effect on shifters than humans. She scanned the tree line through the windows. Did it grow here? If she could get her hands on it, maybe she could trick her wolf into sleeping her way through the next few days. That would help her think more clearly. Or there was that training room she'd passed. Raden said she had full access. Talia plugged in her phone and left her room. This time she remembered the direction she'd passed to get there. The training room was about halfway through the house, so she started walking. It was a ghost town. Even in the middle of the day, nobody wandered the halls. When she worried she'd gone too far, she stopped to recalibrate, then noticed a double set of doors with inset glass and antique candles. Her curiosity got the better of her. She could just take a peek. The handle gave, and the door swung inward on silent hinges. Talia peered through the gap, then couldn't stop from opening the door wider. She'd been in nice libraries before. Her pack had a library of sorts, functional, well-stocked. The university libraries she'd studied in were impressive, but she'd never seen anything like this. The ceilings were high enough that the upper shelves required a rolling ladder, the brass kind, on a track, and the track ran the full circumference of the room. The shelves themselves were dark timber, built into the walls, floor to ceiling, and they were full. There was a reading table in the center with 2 lamps on it, but they weren't needed. Sprawling windows let in enough natural light to make the room glow. Talia's feet moved before her brain caught up, and she stepped into the room, her head tilted up to take in the majesty of it. Then she jumped out of her skin at the sound of a voice. Oh, hello there. Chapter 11. Raden. Raden woke up feeling wrong. Not disoriented, he always knew exactly where he was, but wrong in his body, wrong in his head. He lay still for 30 seconds, taking stock. Pulse too fast, skin too tight. He dreamed of her, but it was already fading to a blur of warmth, weight, and dark hair splayed across his chest. His wolf paced behind his sternum, circling, and when he tried to settle him, he snapped at the effort and redirected Raden's attention to the wall that faced south, where Talia was staying. Don't, he thought. His wolf growled. Raden sat and pressed both palms flat to his thighs, breathing through the immediate wave of energy. His psi abilities were leaking. Had been since Talia arrived, but he could normally sense the edge of it, pull the strings tight. This morning, it was everywhere, which meant anyone who'd walked past his door in the night may have caught the runoff. He prayed that was only Dax as he stood and crossed to the window. Raden pressed his forehead against the cold glass and let the chill cool his blood. Dax's words ran through his head like a slow trickle of hot water. She can't stay here. You're not in control. Too many variables. Raden growled and stalked to his closet. He needed to lift something heavy. He needed to rid his body of this overprotective, obsessive want so he could focus on preparing for the challenge. He grabbed his shirt off the chair, pulled it on, and reached for his gym bag when a knock sounded at the door. He took only 2 steps before the scent hit him. Vanilla cotton. He knew that scent, and it had no business being here at 5 a.m. That meant she'd driven from town, which meant Dax had made a phone call last night without his request or permission. Everything in him cinched tight as he opened the door. Lena. She wore a silk shirt the color of dark wine that stopped high enough on her thighs to encourage his imagination to fill in the rest. Her black hair sat on her shoulders in loose waves, and she wore heels tall enough to make her feet arch. He'd known Lena for 6 years. She was beautiful, wide-set amber eyes, a mouth that always sat in a full half pout, and a body that had occupied his attention more than once during his worst months. Her eyes trailed over him, stopping at the waistband of his pants. Dax called. I'm sure he did. She dragged her eyes up over his chest. You look tense. His hand tightened on the doorframe. Lena. She heard her name as an invitation and stepped into his room. Not past him. Into him, planting one hand flat on his chest, the other catching the door and pushing it closed before his brain engaged. Her hands were already moving, silk sliding up his chest to his shoulders, her fingers finding the back of his neck. Let me help, she murmured. Lena pushed him back, 1 step, 2, 3, until his knees caught the edge of the mattress and he sat. She came with him, climbing onto his lap, one knee on either side of his thighs, settling her weight with enough movement to get the result she wanted. Her hand slid up into his hair and gripped, tilting his head back. Raden stared at her mouth, struggling to breathe. He could want this. It would be easy to close his eyes and take whatever she was ready to give. It would take the edge off. Maybe this was all he needed to. She had a piece of bark caught in her hair last night. The image slammed into his head. Talia, coming in from the rain, standing in the doorway to his den with her clothes plastered to her. And there was a fragment of birch bark caught in her dark hair just above her left ear, and he'd wanted to reach over and take it out. Lena's mouth grazed his jaw. His hand stayed planted to the mattress. They had no interest in being anywhere else as his mind produced the precise angle of Talia's collarbone where her soaked shirt had pulled aside, the hollow at the base of her throat, the way water had tracked down her neck when she pushed her hair back. Lena's fingers tightened in his hair. Where are you, Raden? I'd love for you to join me. She slid her hand down his chest, over his stomach. He was standing in a kitchen watching Talia try not to show how much pleasure his food was bringing her. She didn't know he could see glimpses of what was happening in her head. Bright colors, bursts of reds and yellows as she slipped the fork into her mouth. Raden jumped as Lena's hand slipped beneath his waistband, pushing her off of him. She landed next to him with a thump and stared up at him with flashing eyes. Lena, you want to go slow? She started working at the buttons on her shirt. No, Lena, we can do this however you want, but you could have said something before. You need to go. Raden's tone was flat. He didn't want to scare her, but if she didn't move in the next 10 seconds, he wasn't sure he'd be able to keep from snarling. She scoffed. What? You heard me. She stared at him a moment, disbelieving. Raden, I said, go. Lena stood, wobbling on her heels. Is it true then? You found an Omega and—
Leave, Lena.
Raden stood and pointed at the door. Lena's lips curled into a cruel smile. The Omegas in your own pack weren't good enough for you, His hands tightened until his knuckles cracked. He knew rumors were circulating through some circles in his pack, but those closest to him knew the truth, and that was all that mattered for now. Once he won the seat, he could take the time to explain to everyone else. There would be plenty who still didn't agree with him, and that's why he couldn't waste his energy on convincing them now. Lena strode to the door. She turned to say something else, then shook her head and left. The door clicked shut behind her, and he stood in the silence of the room. Raden pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. The bar in the gym was still loaded from yesterday. He was going to add more weight, and he was going to lift until he couldn't see straight, until he couldn't think about the bridges he was burning, until his brain was too exhausted to be distracted by his wolf looking south. Chapter 12. Talia. The person who spoke was folded into the chair with total physical commitment and impressive flexibility. One foot was kicked over the back, one over an arm, her head tilted like a candy cane over the other. She straightened and smiled. Her face was fine-boned and delicate, but she wasn't a child. She untwisted herself and stood up, still grinning as she walked toward Talia. Are you a hugger? Talia blinked. What? Some people are and some people aren't. The woman stopped an arm's length away, close enough that Talia could see the book still in her hand. It was thick, the spine cracked from heavy use and the cover too worn to read the title. I always think it's better to ask. I'm a hugger, personally, but I've learned not to assume. Talia stared at her. Everything in this house, since the moment she'd arrived, had been frigid. The driver, Raden, Dax. This woman was like a hairdryer over frozen hands. No, Talia said. Thank you. Totally fine. She shoved the book under her arm and stuck out a hand. Vita. Talia took it. Vita's grip was firm, her hand small. Talia. I know. Something moved behind her eyes, and then she was turning back toward the chair, talking. Sit, I'll just move these. She picked up a second book from the seat of the other chair and added it to a stack on the table, then a third from the table itself. I was rereading this one. She held up another worn copy briefly before adding it to the pile, which is slightly embarrassing because it's the fourth time, but I keep finding things I missed. Either proof it's a great book or proof I have a terrible memory, and honestly, I can't rule out either. Talia realized she was leaning in and straightened. What is it? The Interior Distance, Henry Fauchelon. Vita dropped back into her own chair, feet going immediately back over the arm as if that was where they belonged. It's theory, technically, but it reads like— She made a gesture with her free hand. Do you read theory, or what do you read? I've been studying botany. Who was this woman? And why was she answering her questions? Botany? Vita's eyes lit up. Like the science or history of? The science. Plant biology, chemical compounds, medicinal applications. Vita nodded, an eyebrow arched. We have an herb garden. I couldn't tell you what grows there, but— Vita kept talking, but Talia wasn't listening. Something was happening with her wolf. She was on her feet, exuding a kind of brightness, an alertness that was different from anything she'd felt since being with Gracie. There was warmth and comfort and softness. Familiarity. I should go, Talia said, turning on her heel. Already? Vita jumped up. I don't want to intrude. Talia beelined toward the door. I was looking for the gym and I got turned around. Oh, I can show you. It's fine. I'll find it. Another step. Her wolf made a sound of protest that she ignored. This is your home too, you know. Talia stopped. Vita said she knew who she was. What else did she know? And why? Raden's an ass, but not a total ass. Don't let him scare you into sitting in your room all day. Talia's heart jumped. Was Vita like her? Had she been trapped in this house longer than she had? Who? Come on. Vita somehow slipped past her and made it to the door. She pulled it open and looked back over one shoulder. I'll race you. Chapter 13. Talia. She still didn't know who Vida was to this pack, but damn, could she talk and run. She was in the middle of telling her some story about the last time she broke her wrist and how the bone didn't set right, but her body healed too fast, so Raden had to re-break it, when a woman in absurdly high heels and a silk pajama top nearly ran them over. The woman startled, fingers raking through loose, dark waves as she took in the two of them. "Vida," she said, her lips curling. "Lena." All warmth drained out of Vida's voice. Lena's smile widened as she leaned against the wall. Her gaze moved over Talia like she was inspecting a lamp. "A long night," she said, and stretched her neck to one side with the slow, luxurious roll. Her fingers went to her collar, adjusting it. "He's in a mood. You know how he gets." Vida said nothing. "Took forever to settle down." Lena laughed to herself. "He always does, though. Eventually." She tucked a loose tendril of hair behind one ear. "I don't know how you live with Raden, honestly. All that—" She paused, seeming to search for the word. "Intensity?" Talia's wolf lowered her head, baring her teeth. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm. "He called you?" Vida asked. "He didn't have to." Lena pushed off the wall. "That's how we work. I always know." She smoothed the front of her shirt with both hands and glanced once more at Talia. "Well, have a good morning." She winked and slunk past them, her heels clicking. When the sound of her footsteps disappeared, Vida turned. "I heard a car, but I didn't think." Talia was processing everything that just happened and couldn't make sense of it. It sounded as though Vida had known Raden for years, but she also seemed to be living in this house. And that woman, was she Raden's booty call? Did he have Omegas lined up to satisfy him when he couldn't control his moods? And why did Vida seem so shaken by the whole encounter? Was she hoping Raden would call her? Vida grabbed her arm and pulled her forward. Within a few seconds, they were at the door, Talia remembered. Vida pushed it open, and they walked in, finding it blissfully empty. The ceilings were lower here than in the main house, timber-beamed, and mats covered the floor. The walls were stone, same as the rest of the house, but there were hooks along one side and a rack along the other that held actual weapons, practice blades, bow staffs, and a row of sinister-looking knives. The single window at the back was high and narrow, letting in a stream of dawn light. "Come in," Vida said, already in the center of the room, pulling her hair back. "The room doesn't bite." Talia stepped in and let the door swing closed behind her. "What's your usual?" Vida asked. "Striking, mostly. Some grappling." Talia turned in a circle, getting a feel for the space. Silas probably had a room like this to train in at the estate, but she'd never seen anything like it. "My trainer was practical." "Mine, too." Vida was at the rack, running her thumb along the edge of a practice blade. "Your father?" No, a friend. You?" "Older brother." Vida's face screwed up. "I don't recommend it." She motioned to the bag hanging in the corner. "Let's start with that. I want to see what you're working with." Talia's first combination was cautious. While she wanted to unload all her frustration, Vida was so confident it made her nervous. The woman was smaller than she was and had the arms of a bird, but something about the way she held herself made Talia wonder if she actually could beat her in a fight. And more aggravating, she felt the urge to impress her. Talia wrapped her hands and moved through a basic sequence, testing the bag's hang, the resistance, the way the chain responded. When the chain seemed adequate, she hit it properly on the third combination. "That left hook," Vida said. "What about it?" "Do it again. Slower." Talia didn't argue, just did as she asked. "There." Vida stopped her. "You're dropping your elbow a half beat early. You lose 20% of the impact." Talia frowned. She repeated the move, holding the form at extension. "Huh. Thanks." Silas probably would have caught that had they still been training. The adjustment was minimal, but when she ran the hook again, the difference was obvious. The increased power and stability made her arms sing. "Better." Vida stepped back, pleased with herself. "You're a fast learner." Talia was already breathing hard. She moved so Vida could have a go. The smaller woman moved with a precision and strength that seemed impossible, given her size. Her strikes were efficient and her footwork was better than Talia's. She was exact and deadly, not even pretending that raw power was her strategy. They traded off on equipment for a while, Vida still chattering away. When they were both sweaty messes, they dropped to the mat to stretch. "Siblings?" Vida asked. Sister." Talia worked the wrap loose from her knuckles. "Older." "Close?" "She's the reason I learned to fight." It was true, even if she hadn't needed to use her newfound skills to help free Gracie. The truth of Gregor's death still puzzled her. Who had been in his study that night? Vida laughed. "You and me, babies of the family who have to scrap to keep our older siblings in line." Warmth bloomed in Talia's chest. How could she feel so close to Vida after barely more than an hour? She liked her, and it happened quickly, without the usual audit period. Vida said, "Are you—" then stopped short. "What?" "Nothing." She looked at her hands. "I tend to overshare, but I don't expect you to. I was going to ask something I don't have the right to know yet." Talia was too curious not to ask a follow-up question, but before she could get it out, the door to the gym practically came off its hinges. It hit the wall hard enough that Talia was on her feet by the time she saw who'd caused the disturbance. Raden filled the doorway. He was in training clothes, his shoulders curled inward, his face brooding. Gone was the calm from his den or the kitchen the night before. Calm. She'd seen him contained. He looked coiled, ready to snap at the first person who crossed his path. Interesting, considering the story from the woman in the hall. Her wolf growled, remembering that conversation while standing face to face with the man who'd allegedly participated. How dare he use an omega like that when it was supposed to be— "Stop," Talia hissed. She couldn't let her wolf finish that sentence. Energy pulsed through the room, running through her in waves. Raden was a powerful alpha. She'd never felt anything like this when she'd spent time around Mikah, though maybe he had more practice keeping himself in check. Raden looked at her, then at Vida. "Out." Anger surged within her. He was going to waltz in and order them around? Hadn't they discussed this kind of command hours ago? "Excuse me?" Vida snapped before Talia could respond. Raden's jaw worked. "I need the room." "You could ask nicely." She planted her hands on her hips, but when Raden's shoulders dropped, so did hers. "Raden," Vida's voice lowered. "What happened?" He turned, clearing his throat. "I said I need the room." The raw edge was still present in his voice, but his control had snapped back into place for the moment. Vida stared daggers into the back of his head. "With that attitude, you need a training partner, not an opportunity to sulk by yourself on the mats." She walked toward him, forcing him to look at her. And that's when Talia saw it. This was not the interaction of an alpha with another trapped omega. This was something she'd say to Gracie, or that Silas would say to her. "That's your brother?" she blurted. Vida gave her a look that said, "Not now," but Talia couldn't help herself. "You're protective of him? Why?" Raden's breathing picked up speed. "You can go back to your room. I'll have someone bring you breakfast." There was the bossiness she knew so well. "I was talking to Vida, not you." He turned to face her. "Talia." The word rumbled through her, making her skin prick. She held her ground. If she was going to learn what made Raden Calder tick, she couldn't keep running from him every time he threw a hissy fit. And what better way to see his weaknesses than on the training mat? "It's a big room." She folded her arms. "I'll stay on my half." Raden's eyes widened. I know what you said." Vida worked to stifle a smile, then clapped a hand on Raden's shoulder. "You know what? I just remembered I have some things to clean up in the library. Why don't you use Talia as your partner today?" "I don't need—" Raden started, but Vida was already halfway to the door. "Work him hard, Talia. He needs an attitude adjustment. Obviously, Lena's attempt wasn't successful." She shot Raden a scathing look, then disappeared into the hall. Chapter 14. Talia. The door clicked shut behind Vida, the sound echoing off the bare walls. Raden's cheeks flushed at Vita's last comment, and Talia thought she might be sick. Was he like Gregor? Were all alphas in their region just as thrilled about the registry as he was, chomping at the bit to use their omegas to satisfy their every whim and desire? "It's despicable what you're doing," she said. An attitude adjustment wasn't going to cut it. He needed to hear the down and dirty truth. It seemed that he was going to ignore her comment. He walked to the bag and picked up a roll of wrap, preparing his hands to fight. "Please, enlighten me." "You're supposed to protect us. Them, I mean." She stumbled over her words. "Your omegas, not trade them like cattle and force them into your bed to be your comfort blanket." Raden's eyes snapped up. He tore a strip off the roll with his teeth. "We're not your property. You don't get to use—" He hit the bag. Once, hard enough to make her jump. "I'm surprised you aren't alpha, with all your expertise." Talia barked a laugh. "Well, if alphas were chosen based on brains instead of brawn, we likely wouldn't have a breeding crisis." He hit, getting into a rhythm. "You're right. The omegas I know definitely respond to critical reasoning and not this." Raden paused and stripped off his shirt, his chest already glistening with a sheen of sweat. Heat gathered in her middle, her wolf's tongue lolling out. Damn it. He had a point, but she wasn't going to admit it. "Maybe, but they're not conceiving for a reason. You say it's genetic weakness, I say?" he snapped. "No, I don't say." Talia frowned, not understanding. Raden started another sequence. "Anyway, maybe if omegas felt safe, their ovaries would cooperate." Raden paused, breathing hard. "Maybe if omegas let alphas help keep them safe, they wouldn't have to work so hard to do it themselves." Wow. And once again she'd wasted her breath trying to explain something to a man who wasn't ready to listen. It's too bad that whatever Lena was supposed to fix this morning didn't take. Maybe if she just listened a little harder. That's enough. Raden rounded the bag. Every instinct inside of her begged to retreat, to walk away, to give in to the energy pressing on her shoulders like a weighted blanket. But enough was enough. She gritted her teeth. "Just agreeing with you. We omegas have a lot to learn when it comes to trusting and pleasing our alphas." "You're poking at something you don't understand." "Then explain it to me." Talia walked onto the mat, stopping in the center. "If you want me to trust you, earn it." If Raden only responded to strength, then she would give it. She didn't want to spar, given that he was twice Silas's size, and she'd left with enough bruises from those sessions to last a lifetime. But one round on the mats would surely give her some tidbit that she could take back to Mikah and Gracie. The new bruises would be worth it. Raden descended the 2 steps to stand in front of her. "What's your training?" "Does it matter?" "It matters if I'm going to set parameters." "Vita thought I could handle you," she said. "Do you trust her assessment?" Raden set his feet. "Fine. Have it your way." They circled, but he moved deliberately slow, and it blew oxygen on the coals already simmering inside her. She jabbed and missed, and when Raden came at her, she slipped left, her block catching his arm, but only managing to drive her back 2 steps. He drove again, and this time she was ready. She let him come all the way through and redirected instead of blocking. She got around his guard for half a second before he closed it. Not enough, but she'd found the angle. The force of it sang up through her forearms. She reset, shook it out. A fraction. That was a fraction of the power he had. Talia thought of Vita. Remembering she couldn't beat him with sheer strength or rage, for that matter, she needed to use what she had, her smarts and speed. "Do you pay your omegas, or are they required to attend to you as part of their pack duties?" Raden growled, and his feet faltered. She got in a quick jab to the tender spot on his lower back, then scurried out of his reach. Interesting. He didn't like being called out on his actions. At least he felt a little shame for his behavior. Gregor probably would have enjoyed her noticing, been proud of it. "How often?" she continued. "Every night? Is that why you were up when I returned? Does Dax enjoy these privileges for being your second?" Raden made a sound in his throat, and she got inside his guard, driving up and forward with all her weight behind it. For 1 second, She had him genuinely off balance. And then his hand closed around her wrist and the world tilted. She was on her back on the mat, the breath punched out of her. His chest radiated heat through the thin fabric of her shirt, his forearms bracketing her shoulders. Raden pressed into her and pinned her to the floor with his sheer mass and weight. "Whatever Lena said, it isn't true." His breath came in ragged bursts. "She came to me, and I sent her away." Talia struggled against his grip, but a sharp pain radiated from her right shoulder. It felt too loose, out of place. "Raden, you know other alphas, but you don't know me." His face was inches from hers, his eyes boring into her. They were dark with green and gold flecks, the light from the window making them shine like gems. Was this true? Had Lena lied to them in the hall? What motivation would she have to do that? "I know that you're using me," she grunted, jamming her knee into his hip. Raden countered by wrapping his leg over hers, and she forced the rest of her sentence out. "Why would it be any different for the others?" Raden adjusted his hips, and the movement sent a wash of scent over her. He was flooding her nose, her mouth, her head, and her pain was only getting worse. The adrenaline coursing through her system began to fade, leaving behind a raw, screaming shoulder. It was dislocated. When he took her to the floor, it must have popped out of its socket. It used to happen regularly when she was a kid, and the sensation was burned into her memory. "Raden, I think—" He tightened his grip on her wrist, and she cried out in pain. The set expression on his face turned to confusion, then fear. "What?" "My shoulder," she forced out. "I think it's dislocated." Raden released his grip, pushing up to take his weight off of her. "Don't move." Chapter 15. Raden. Raden heard it. The sound her shoulder made when his grip torqued wrong. A wet, dense pop that didn't register until she cried out. He scrambled back, a pit growing in his stomach. He'd hurt her, and she was making a sound he never wanted to hear again in his life. He fell to his knees. Talia. The color was draining from her face, her breath coming in short, controlled bursts as her left hand had shot up to cradle her right arm against her body. "Let me." She tried to get up, but fell back with a strangled gasp. "No." The word came out compressed, bitten off. She didn't want him to help, and why would she? He was the one who did this. He ran the assessment in his head. Position of her arm, angle of impact. Why couldn't he control himself? She'd accused him of being a boar-headed alpha, and here he was proving her right. He wanted to tell her that this wasn't him. He didn't seek to dominate Omegas or use them for his own selfish wants and needs. But anything he said now would fall flat. He looked back at the door. If she didn't want him here, he could find Dax. His wolf snarled with such force he had to brace himself against the mats. She was on the floor. She was hurt. He was the cause of it. His wolf's position on who was going to fix this was not open to discussion. "I'm going to—" He stopped, started again. "I can put it back." Talia's head came up. Her face was blanched except for 2 spots of color high on her cheeks. "What?" "I've done it before. I know how." "Yeah, you're not touching me." She tried to sit up, one-handed, her jaw set. "Get my phone, and I can call a doctor." "Talia." He reached for her, but she pulled back. "The closest doctor is a half-hour away by car. You need it set now. Every minute you wait—" "I know what dislocation is." Her voice came out sharp, breathing through the pain. "But I'm not—" She tried to move again and cried out. It felt like someone punched through his sternum. Raden put one hand on Talia's good shoulder and pressed her back to the mat. Not hard, but firm. She growled, her eyes flashing. "I know." If she thought he was a controlling, stubborn ass, then so be it. If he couldn't change her mind, at least he could take the pain away. "I know. I'm sorry." "Get off!" "I'm sorry." He kept the pressure steady, kept his voice low. "I'm going to fix it, and then you can be angry with me, but you need to let me fix it first." "You don't get to!" She sucked in a breath, gasping at the pain. "Stop moving. You're making it worse." She hissed through her teeth. Her left hand had curled into a fist against the mat. She was looking at him with wild eyes, and he recognized everything there: pain, fury, and most of all, fear. His control, which had been barely there since Lena showed up at his door, frayed further, and the energy he kept packed into a tight ball released. Raden felt it go, and fought to contain it, but there was nothing he could do. He was weak, depleted, and now he was dangerous on top of everything. The edges of his own awareness blurred, and Talia went eerily still. Her eyes flared as he reached for the threads. It was like trying to catch dandelion seeds after a gust of wind blew them free. He couldn't stop it. He had nothing left to stop it. His dream surfaced first. How Talia came to him in the middle of the night and curled into him, her hands on his bare skin, her hair spread out on his pillow. Then it was the flick of her tongue as she ate the food he made for her, the feel of her cold skin against his hand. Lena with her fingers in his hair and him wishing it was Talia instead. His sigh energy stripped him of secrets, even the ones he hid from himself. Talia was an Omega. He'd forced her here, and even though he said the right things and wanted to believe them, his basest desires were exactly what she'd assumed. He wanted to possess her. He wanted her to be available to him at any moment, to share his bed. The desire was primal and urgent, and maybe that was why having her here knocked him off balance. Or maybe he'd never been balanced to begin with. Raden moved. He had to be fast. If she expected it and braced, the pain would be worse. He repositioned her arm, and before she could process what was happening, he set the joint. The sound Talia made drove straight through his ribs and pierced his heart. Her grip on his arm went white. Then her whole body went slack, her eyes going glassy and distant. His wolf lunged, tearing through him like a flame to gasoline, and another shift took him from the inside out. He was weak, too scared to do what needed to be done to protect even a wounded Omega. His wolf moved over her, staking his claim, howling until the color came back into her face, until she drew a deep breath, until she opened her eyes and saw his true strength. Chapter 16. Talia. Talia knew theoretically that Raden would be large in wolf form, but knowing and seeing him take up the center of the training room were two different experiences. The rack of equipment behind him looked like it had been built for a dollhouse. Her shoulder pulsed, and her legs were unsteady under her as she scrambled back and stood. Raden watched her. He wasn't baring his teeth, but he also wasn't settled. The energy coming off him was the physical embodiment of whatever had been swirling in her head. All of that chaos and passion now funneled through a being with claws and teeth, and who was currently making a sound low in his chest that she felt in the backs of her molars. Raden? She kept her voice low, not wanting to spook him. What had she just seen? Were those Raden's thoughts? The world through his eyes? He was Sai. He had to be. But how could he be alpha of his pack with such a dangerous adaptation? Unless his pack didn't know. That would explain how empty his house was, why he never seemed to take company in his pack. Raden's wolf's eyes snapped to her, dark, filled with the frustration and raw power she recognized in his human form, but running off leash. He shook his head, agitated, and she understood. This was why he'd run from her room, why he'd shown up in a mood at the gym. Raden didn't have unity with his wolf. Her heart started to race. An alpha in crisis could fracture from his wolf, the animal and the man pulling in opposite directions until neither one could get traction. Silas had mentioned it once in reference to Gregor, wondering if that was why his father retreated to his room each night. When an alpha comes apart, you can't reach the man until you've settled the wolf. Talia should have thought twice before she tore off her clothes and shifted, but it was all instinct. It hurt more with her tender shoulder, even though it was back in place. The bone and muscle reformed around damaged tissue with a snap of bright agony that punched through the usual discomfort and left her gasping on 4 paws. She felt Raden's pain before she saw him clearly. Shifting together was an intimate act, because wolves became legible to each other in wolf form, and Raden was broadcasting everything. The fracture she'd suspected was deafening now that her senses were heightened. The man and the wolf were in conflict, and Raden's psi abilities amplified all of it until the walls vibrated. She took a step toward the door, and he dropped his head low, showing her his teeth. "You won't hurt me," she said, not sure if he could hear her in his head since they weren't of the same pack. He snapped, but she didn't stop. She moved at an angle, and he still charged. She went low, dropping her shoulder and meeting his chest with her weight. For one moment, they were locked, and then she stopped, pushing back. Talia's wolf dropped her head and exposed the back of her neck. Not submission, but a signal that said, I am not a threat. Raden's wolf stilled. Talia pressed her shoulder against his chest and stayed. She couldn't leave him like this as much as she wanted to. There were many reasons she'd wanted to study botany, but the main one was for healing. She didn't agree with what Gregor and Harlan were doing with the registry, but she was concerned with the weakening of their magic and rising infertility rate. Here, right in front of her, was an alpha with power he couldn't control, abilities the rest of the pack would be terrified of. But if they kept weeding out the most powerful among them, how would they usher back in an age of strength? Raden's ragged breaths began to slow. His want, regret, and fear rolled through her, ending with a wave of grief. His head dropped. His weight shifted against her, and she held steady. His wolf was coming back to him. Or he was coming back to his wolf. She couldn't tell which direction the reunion ran. Raden stepped back, dropping his head to look at her. His eyes were wide, inky pools, open and curious instead of guarded and defensive. Before she could stop it, her wolf moved in and nipped the bottom of Raden's chin. Talia held her breath. She'd just acknowledged him as her alpha. Not an alpha in general, but hers. In an instant, the shift tore through him. She'd seen people shift before, but never like this. Most people moved through the change quickly, the body finding its other form the way water finds a drain, efficient and smooth. Raden came back in pieces, every part of him being forced into submission until his naked body collapsed to the mat in front of her. Just like the first time she'd seen him, she stood in awe of his size and strength. He looked sculpted, with his arms protecting his head and his legs drawn in toward himself. He was beautiful. Her wolf whined at his shaking, sniffing and pawing at the mat next to him. He was also in pain. Why would he still be in pain? Talia shifted back, her shoulders screaming its objection, and pulled her clothes on. Raden's clothes were shredded, so there was nothing she could do about his current state. At least the fork in the forest made sense. He'd had it in his pocket when he left her room. Talia dropped to the mat next to him. Raden? Nothing. His face was gray, his breathing stilted. Raden, what do you need? His jaw worked, his body shaking so badly the motions moved through the mat and into her bones. If he was trying to speak, he couldn't manage it. She glanced at the door. Dax or Vita had to be somewhere in this house. Maybe they'd know how to— Hide, Raden groaned. Hide me. Talia wondered if she'd heard him right, but he repeated it again. Hide me. The alpha who had claimed her, who led his pack and wanted to challenge for the high alpha seat, was lying on the floor of his own gym asking her to protect his naked, quivering body. But how? She couldn't get him out of the gym. He weighed twice what she did, and her right arm was currently useless. Or was this the opportunity she'd been searching for? Was this how she protected her family? By standing up and walking out, leaving him here for someone in his pack to discover. Her phone was a few paces away. She could take a video of this, send it to Harlan, prove that Raden Calder was unstable, a threat to the packs. It took her less than 2 seconds to decide. And again, it was all instinct. She dropped to the mat, moving in close against his back, her good arm coming over him, her knees pulling up behind his. She pressed her forehead to the back of his neck and gripped him, willing his muscles to stop firing. Raden was burning up, not freezing like she would have assumed. She, however, was cold from the shift, and the heat exchange between them felt blissfully symbiotic. She pressed her hand to his heart, willing it to slow as she took deep breaths against his shoulder blades. At that moment, nothing about her life felt familiar. She shouldn't be trying to help Raden. She shouldn't be pressed up against him, his body heat bleeding into hers. But she couldn't force herself to let go. Raden wasn't who she'd thought he was. But who was he really? Why was he challenging for the high alpha seat when he couldn't control his own shifts? If he needed protecting now, what about when he had thousands of eyes watching him? Alphas and council members from all over North America. Raden's hand wrapped around hers, clutching it to his chest. Then he rolled, somehow protecting her shoulder while switching their positions and wrapping his body around hers, pulling her into his middle like the yolk of an egg. His breath warmed the crown of her head, his arms like a weighted blanket. Talia closed her eyes, shivering at the heat soaking through her skin. Her wolf let out a satisfied huff, and before Talia could push back, her mind was dropped into a kitchen she didn't recognize. Small and worn, the wallpaper pulling at the corners. A boy who she somehow understood was Raden sat at a table with both hands flat on the wood, staring at a ring sitting in front of him. It was thick, masculine, and much too big to be his. The boy swiped it off the table, then dropped his head and began to sob. The vision dissolved, and there was Vita. She was younger, early 20s maybe. She stood in a doorway with Raden in front of her. They were arguing. Talia couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. The feeling was there. Raden was terrified of something, and Vita was scared for him. They didn't know how to be separate from each other even when they needed to be. Then Raden was in his den. The furniture was overturned, papers strewn across the floor, and Raden stood in the center of it, his breathing ragged, his hands in his hair. Dax was in the doorway, his arms crossed. "I won't do it." Raden's voice was rough. "Dax, I will not." "The registry, I know what it is." Raden turned and she could see his face now, twisted with disgust. "I know exactly what it is. You think I can't see where this is heading? What they want to do with the Omegas?" He slammed both hands against the desk. "I won't participate in it." "You don't have a choice." The vision melted. Talia lay still inside Raden's cocoon and didn't move for a long moment. His heartbeat had slowed, and his body wasn't shaking. Was he awake? Had he just seen everything she had? Why was his mind flipping through these memories? Were they pieces he wanted her to see or random reflections? She had 1,000 questions that she wasn't brave enough to ask. "I'm sorry. I hurt you." Raden's voice rumbled through her, his arms still holding her tight. He didn't seem concerned that he was lying naked on the mats or that his body was slick with sweat. "I barely feel it," she whispered. "That doesn't—" "It's fine." "It's not fine." He adjusted his position but didn't let her go. Every twitch of his muscles sent a jolt through her, putting every nerve on high alert. "I know what you think of me." "Raden." "And you're not wrong." He let go of her all at once, and she shivered as cool air rushed in around her. Rustling noises told her he was looking for something, probably his clothes, which were completely non-functional. "Here." She sat and pulled off her shirt, tossing it in his general direction without turning to face him. When she finally looked, he tied the fabric around his waist. She almost laughed. It looked like he was wearing a little girl's skirt. Talia took in his alpha physique, the visible display of his dominance and strength, and her stomach sank. Mikah would kill him. If someone triggered Raden's shift, he'd either be fighting his wolf or lying on the floor in a trembling heap. Either way, he was vulnerable. It was exactly the information she'd been looking for, and yet the thought of turning it over made her woozy. Maybe that was why she stayed, why she tried to comfort him and handed him her shirt. "I'll walk you to your room." Talia pushed up from the floor. "I can get there myself." She swallowed, the guilt bubbling in her gut, and gave a pointed look at his midsection. "Sure, but I need my shirt back." Chapter 17. Raden. His legs started giving out halfway down the hall. Now Talia had her shoulder under his arm, and he was doing approximately 40% of the work of keeping him upright. "I can walk," he said. "You're leaning." "Purposefully." She scoffed, and it was close enough to a laugh that pleasure rippled through him. Ever since she laughed the other night in the kitchen, he wanted to force a repeat. But surprisingly, passing out in a naked heap didn't seem to count for comedy these days. His hand grazed the bare skin of her waist. She only wore a sports bra since she'd given him her shirt, which covered roughly the area of a large napkin. Still, he was grateful. She could have left him on the mats to fend for himself. He sobered, remembering that he had no reason to believe Talia would keep what she'd seen to herself. "If you talk to anyone about this, I'll be very specific about size," she said. "Extra large. Does that work?" He laughed, and the sound was so shocking he nearly stumbled. "You're funny." "I know." Raden glanced over at her, desperate to find a smile on her face, but she stared straight ahead. "I like you," he said, a strange fuzziness in his head. He'd never felt this light after a shift. It was as if his feet would lift off the floor. Talia raised an eyebrow. "You're delirious." He stopped when they reached the door to his room, and it took Talia a moment to realize they'd arrived. "Do you want to see it?" he asked. She shrugged. "I already took a good look in the training room." Raden opened his mouth, then snapped it closed, realizing where her eyes were tracking. He couldn't help a grin spreading across his face. "I meant my room." "I know what you meant." She winked, then motioned for him to hand her the shirt around his waist. He recognized the strategy immediately because it was typically one he used. He'd already used it with her, in fact, but now he didn't need to push her away like he had been. Like he told Dax he would. He didn't need to ignore the pull toward her wolf because the damage was already done. She'd seen him at his lowest. There was nothing else to hide. And the way his wolf had settled, the way the pain had stopped without him suffering on the floor for hours, told him her proximity didn't have to mean his downfall. What if she was not only his leverage, but the force that would allow him to succeed in this challenge? What if isolation wasn't what he needed after all? The thought made warmth flood his being from head to toe, until he realized that Talia had decided the opposite. She'd seen his true nature and was stepping away. Whatever pull she felt, and he knew she felt a pull, hadn't swayed her. She didn't want to feel anything for him. She didn't care if their wolves were yanking them together at every opportunity. She wanted to go back to hating him, but she'd seen too much. So instead of accepting this newfound closeness, she'd joke about it, force as much emotional distance as possible, because... He stilled when he saw her hand tighten on her bag. Her phone. She hadn't pulled it out, but she'd reached for it, reminded herself it was there all the way down the hall. She was going to tell them. The second she was alone, she'd tell her sister, Mikah's mate, everything she'd seen. It would give him a secret weapon to use once they were face to face. All Mikah would need to do to win was target a shift, and based on what just happened, she probably understood exactly how to do that too. Raden pulled the shirt from his waist and tossed it to her, not bothering to cover himself up. She hadn't looked in the training room. He'd watched her turn her head when he got up, and even now she forced her eyes above his chest, her heart rate spiking. He didn't want to play games with her anymore. He was a little woozy from the shift, but what he'd said was honest. He liked Talia. He'd brought her here not knowing the first thing about her, but she was beautiful and feisty. She didn't give him what he wanted, and that was the first time that had happened in ages. She was strong and compassionate, even if she pretended not to care. He'd felt all of that when he shifted. He'd seen it in her head. Maybe he was delirious. Maybe Dax was right that Talia was dangerous and he was susceptible to any Omega in his current state. It didn't help that Talia's scent was all over him, on his chest and in his hands. She was covered in him too, which was driving him even more wild. Maybe it was even simpler. Maybe he was being selfish, using her in his desperation to win this challenge. But if she was going to give Mikah a leg up in this duel, he was at least going to fight for his own. "Stay with me," Raden said, and Talia's eyes widened. "What?" Her heart rate jumped, which told him all he needed to know. She'd thought about him. Even if she hated the thoughts, they were there. "Your wolf is interested. I can feel it." Talia scoffed, pulling her shirt over her head. "You're an egotistical ass. I know." He exhaled, still putting his entire self on display, willing her control to slip. "But you know that's not all I am." You know your accusations about me and Omega's. I know that's what you want me to think, she snapped, pointing at her temple. You're Sai. You can put whatever you want here, and it doesn't have to be the truth. That stung more than he wanted to admit. That was the reason he had to keep his abilities a secret. Leadership in any pack wouldn't trust what they saw there either. It's the truth, he said, the amusement draining from his voice. Talia's expression softened a fraction before her walls went back up. Stay with me, he said again, and Talia held his eyes with hers. Then slowly she lowered them, trailing over his chest, his stomach, and landing exactly where he'd been tempting her to look. Her brows twitched. She stared a long moment, and his heart started to race. Another few seconds, and he was ready to jump out of his skin. Then her lips parted before her eyes flicked back up to his. I hope you get some rest. She turned on her heel, and the ache he'd felt when he woke from his dream returned full force. I couldn't help myself, you know, he called out behind her. I wasn't planning to see you. None of this was supposed to happen. She turned, fire in her eyes. Before she could tell him off, he continued. I thought about the bark in your hair for 2 days. A piece of birch bark. You had it above your left ear when you came in from the rain, and I wanted to take it out. I thought about it for 2 days. Silence. That hasn't happened for me, he said. Not in years, not since. He stopped again. I can't stop thinking about you. I've always been able to control my head. It's one of the things I'm best at. He shook his head. I'm not good at it with you. It was all true. But whether she believed it was another story. She wet her lips and was about to speak when Dax burst into the corridor. His eyes widened when he saw Raden completely nude, then again when he saw Talia across from him. Talia bolted, disappearing around the corner in a flash. Excellent timing, Raden muttered, but Dax cut him off. I need you to sit down. Raden motioned at himself. I need to... Dax held up his phone, shoving the screen in front of his face. Filed this morning, 6 a.m., Mikah invoked the unsettled seat provision, formal challenge to the high alpha seat, citing destabilization of territory and high alpha contenders. Shit. He'd actually done it? How long? 48 hours before you have to appear in front of the council. Harlan gave a location. Well, 46 now. The Whitmore grounds. Dax's jaw was tight. It's a 17-hour drive. We'd need to leave by midday to have any margin, unless... No. Raden shook his head. Flying was out of the question. The last time he'd been on a plane, his energy spiked and he'd nearly sent the plane into a ravine. Does Vita know? Dax nodded. She'll come. He shifted on his feet. The radius between you and Talia. She'll need to come, but I can hold her at a distance. Raden shook his head, a small blossom of hope blooming in his chest. No. She comes with me. It wouldn't be too hard to convince her since her sister would be at this meeting. Alphas were required to appear with their mates. Dax grunted. She comes with me, Raden repeated. Harlan will smell weakness a mile away if she isn't at my side. He'll smell weakness if you shift in the middle of his dining room. Raden put a hand on Dax's shoulder. I won't. You won't? That's your statement? Dax gestured at his full frontal. I won't. Raden projected more confidence than he felt. But something had flipped between him and Talia in the training room, and she knew it too. He had no choice but to go all in. It was all, or it was nothing. And she'd be the one to decide which. Chapter 18. Talia. Talia overheard everything from the hall. Mikah had issued his formal challenge, and Raden was insisting she travel with him to Telluride, the Whitmore grounds. The thought of stepping foot there made her teeth grind. Harlan had taken over that land when Mikah removed him from the estate. She flopped onto the bed and opened up the message waiting for her from Gracie. Gracie. Talia, I'm sorry. Silas is sorry. We didn't have a choice. Talia. What the hell? Gracie. Did I mention we're sorry? Harlan forced the issue. If we waited even one more day, he would have had the votes to close the provision window. We'd have lost any legitimate path. Talia. You should have told me. Gracie. We didn't know until last night. Silas found out at midnight from a contact on the council staff. There wasn't time to loop you in and still make the deadline. Talia blew out a breath. The timing was faster than expected, but she already had what she needed. She would have texted them today regardless. She should have texted them already, but she'd been lying on the gym floor with Raden Calder. Her thumbs hovered over the keyboard. She was going to do this, wasn't she? This was her family. Yes, she felt for Raden, and no, surprisingly, she didn't want him to die. But what other option did she have? She wouldn't watch her sister lose a mate. Silas. Mike is ready. You don't need to feel pressure to help. Just stay safe. Talia. Raden's bringing me to Whitmore. I have what you need. We can talk there. Too much to type. She didn't need to tell them now. It would be easier to explain it in person, especially if she could tell Mikah directly. Gracie and Silas responded appropriately with all the celebration emojis, and tears pricked her eyes. She was going home. Maybe not permanently, not quite yet, but soon she'd be back with her family. Mikah would be alpha, and Raden would be dead. It was exactly as it should be. Like nothing had changed. A sharp knock at her door made her jolt, and she swiped at her cheeks. She was happy. It was a lot to process all at once. That's all this was. Yes, she called, and Vida swept into her room like a weather event. He got the challenge this morning. She closed the door and turned to face her, eyes wide. Mikah Kade, we have 48 hours to appear in Colorado. Talia pretended to be shocked, but apparently didn't sell it. Vida's jaw dropped. You knew? Talia held up her phone. My sister texted me. It wasn't completely a lie, but the misinformation niggled at her. I also overheard Raden talking with Dax. Vida lifted a brow, and that expression was like a truth serum. The rest came tumbling out. Raden shifted. I egged him on. I wanted him to spar with me because he was being an ass. He absolutely was. But I didn't know it would... She stopped short. I didn't know. Vida nodded once, her lips pressing together. Then she dropped her arms and walked to the bed, throwing herself down on the mattress next to her. He keeps it a secret, and I swear that only makes it worse. Like, at some point, he's going to have to trust people. He may as well start with his own pack. Talia thought of her own reaction to finding out he was Psy. I don't know. The political environment isn't exactly friendly right now. Vida scoffed. Tell me about it. The Cades? She spit out the name like a curse word. Talia turned to her side, lying down and propping her head in her hand. I get why you hate them, but I think you only really hate Gregor. His sons are just as bad. They're not. Talia's tone was pleading. At least Silas isn't, and my sister wouldn't be with Mikah if he had anything in common with his father. Vida looked skeptical. You know this family's history. The registry, the forced pairings, the Omegas, who went in and didn't come back out. Do you know what Gregor did to the Whitfield Omegas? Do you know about the Harrow Pack? What happened to the females there when they couldn't conceive? Talia was quiet. She knew some of it, obviously. Her own sister had been held at his estate. But she'd never heard about Whitfield or the Harrow Pack. She didn't know if she could stomach more of the details. My sister was one of them, she whispered. I know what he was capable of. But Mikah and my sister aren't going to perpetuate what Gregor built. I'm sure you believe that? But it's not just the Cades. Talia knew that too. The council hadn't turned over the second Gregor died. I trust my sister's judgment, and I trust Silas. They wouldn't... She stopped, a small, cold thought entering her head. Would they? She knew their intentions, but with the council pressure and the deals brokered with humans that Silas was always telling her about, could they? Vida clicked her tongue. Harlan has more power than you think. Even if Mikah is different, Harlan has 3 council votes and 2 pack captains and debts called in from every corner of the region. He'll make Micah's tenure a war. Then wouldn't it be the same with Raden? Vida shook her head. We have our own council. Harlan wouldn't lose all his power if Raden took the seat, but he'd have to split it. He wouldn't be allowed to continue encroaching on territory like he has been. That shut Talia up. She hadn't even considered that. Vita continued. Raden has 3 Omega families sheltered in the Northern Holding who can't go back to their packs. He moves resources through backdoor channels because Harlan has his fingers in everything. As Alpha, he's refused registry participation for our pack. It's the only reason I'm still here, and it's cost him in more ways than one. He can't change the system from inside a single territory. He's known that for years. The only way to actually change it is the high Alpha seat. Vita rolled to her back, running a hand through her hair. That's why he had to use the registry. He has to look like the kind of Alpha the council will accept. Stable, mated, participating in their bullshit. She looked at Talia. You understand what I'm saying? She understood. Raden had snapped some of it at her in the training room. He wasn't trying to control Omegas. He'd filed the claim on her because the council responded to matched Alphas, because a lone Alpha making a power play looked like instability, and a mated Alpha using the legal routes to gain power was respected. He wanted to do it himself. He still couldn't stand the idea of allowing his Omegas to land on the list, Vita said. But I'm sorry that his plan dragged you into this. Talia's throat thickened. Could it be true that they all wanted the same things? Could it be true that Raden's plan may have a higher likelihood of success? That he'd have more impact stifling Harlan Voss than Mikah would? He's lonely, Vita murmured. He's been so isolated for so long, trying to hide what he is. That's why he's never taken a mate. There were and still are plenty of Omegas who... She stopped, rolling her eyes. Well, you saw what that looked like. The woman in the hall. Right. Talia's wolf let out a low growl. There was another sharp knock at the door, and Vita and Talia both bolted upright. Dax swung the door open and blinked. Well, looks like I won't have trouble convincing you two to join us for a slumber party. Vita laughed out loud. Dax, are you mad you weren't invited? Dax's cheeks colored, but he ignored the question. A challenge has been issued for the high Alpha seat. We're required to depart within the hour. He turned to Talia. I'm told your family will be in attendance. Her heart leaped, even though she already knew that tidbit of information. Give me a bag, and I'll get packed. Vita squeezed her arm and ran from the room, and as Talia watched her leave, dread settled in the pit of her stomach. They were set on a collision course that neither of them could change. Raden or Mikah. One of them was going to die, and there was nothing she or Vita could do about it. Chapter 19. Raden. The highway unspooled in long gray ribbons, and Raden told himself he wasn't eavesdropping on the conversation happening 4 feet behind him. Vita and Talia hadn't stopped talking since they got in the van, which wasn't abnormal for Vita, but Talia? He was addicted to the sound of her voice. He adjusted the air for the 1,000th time and stared at the trees, pretending they were anything more than a green blur. Talia's wolf had been poking at him for the last hour, and his wolf was pawing in agitation. He could barely sit comfortably in his seat, and nobody around them knew it was happening. It was like her hands were down the front of his pants, under a table at a restaurant. She was driving him insane, and he couldn't do a damn thing about it. Another gentle prod, and Raden clenched his teeth. Talia must be enjoying herself, especially since any of his attempts to give her the same treatment seemed to have no effect, and only made his situation worse. Okay, Vita announced, along with the sound of her unfolding herself from the rearmost seat. I'm coming up. Keep your seatbelt on, Dax barked. She was already climbing through the gap in the captain chairs. She dropped into the seat behind Dax and leaned forward. Dax, your calves are going to cramp. Move the seat back. Dax gave her a look, and Vita laughed. The council session. Walk me through the strategy again. As Dax happily launched into an explanation, Raden finally had a moment of clear access to Talia's head. She wasn't talking or laughing, just relaxing in the back seat, which meant her thoughts were clear and unmuddled. Since she'd spoken to him in their shifted forms, their connection had been stronger. He could hear her thoughts intermittently, though he tried not to violate her privacy, but right now, he didn't care. He'd use any tool in his arsenal to fight fire with fire. He let himself go still and found the frequency between them, the line that had been running since their moment on the mats. She was there, a warmth and curiosity that stuttered when she felt him orient there. Good. She'd noticed. He reached back along that line and sent her the first image in his head. After feeling her pressed against him, his mind had come up with all kinds of possibilities while he napped against the window in the first hours of their drive. He decided to share them. He sent the warmth of her skin under his palms, the way he imagined she'd fit against him in the dark. He let her feel his excitement at the thought. Anticipation. From the back seat, Talia coughed. Raden's pupils dilated until the sunlight burned. He sat perfectly still, composed. The heat running up his spine was not visible to anyone in this vehicle, and he worked to keep it that way. Raden waited 30 seconds, 40, his heart beating out of his chest. Then he sent another visual. This one he'd thought about more than he wanted to admit. Up until the floodgates burst that morning, he'd fought it and mostly lost. Now he let it roll through his head with startling clarity. Talia sat in front of him at the kitchen counter. But this time, he didn't watch. He untied his apron and rounded the island, his hand finding the pulse of her throat and tipping her head back so he could taste her. He let her feel his tongue on her skin, his hand in her hair. You know, Vita said. Talia didn't respond. Talia, are you... Oh yeah, definitely. Her voice was a rasp, and it was a shot of pure adrenaline to his veins. Dax adjusted his hands on the wheel. Whether he'd noticed his jackhammer of a heart or was simply stretching his grip, there was no way to... You're going to have a stroke, Dax said, under his breath. Raden nearly choked on the water he'd just poured into his mouth. He spluttered, replacing his water bottle. You okay? Vita asked, patting his shoulder. Geez, Raden, turn on the AC, you're sweating. Talia snorted, and Raden, in desperation, sent one last picture into her head. He wasn't going to lose this round, Dax be damned. He stood in his office, Talia on the other side of the desk. She'd been angry that first night, and for all her bravado, he'd heard enough from her wolf to know that the thing she was frightened most by was how much she wanted to submit. She hated pack hierarchy. Vita was the same. But Talia was still an Omega. Her biology didn't care about ideals. Her body wanted to be claimed. He'd felt it when he pressed her into the mats. But that was what alphas failed to recognize. Submission only bloomed with trust. Not that he was a perfect alpha. Hell, he had next to no experience in this area. But maybe that was why he understood it. He'd seen enough alphas around him fail to recognize the patterns. So Raden showed her his version. Sparring on the mats, her strength and power, matching each other, pushing each other. Then, when he had her alone, I need some air, Talia blurted from the back seat. Is anyone else hungry? I'm hungry. Can we stop? Dax shot him a look as he took the next exit. Raden didn't even try to hide his grin. But he was going to have to spend the next 30 seconds thinking about irrigation, infrastructure, or livestock regulation. Otherwise, the second he stepped out of this van, he'd have a hard time hiding what he'd been up to. Vita had the menu open before she'd fully sat down. They have a patty melt. That's not a selling point, Raden said. Her eyes widened. A patty melt with hash browns? The hash browns look hand-cut. Dax grimaced. The hash browns are on a picture menu. I'm an optimist. Vita was already flagging down the waitress. Talia had taken the seat across from him, which was convenient. He stretched out his legs, slowing as his calf rubbed against hers. Talia jumped, her knees making the table clatter. Oh, sorry, he said. Not much leg room. Vita gave him a sidelong glance, and he couldn't hide his smirk. Talia's cheeks stained pink as she wrapped both hands around her mug. She took a sip and made a face. This is the worst coffee I've ever had. It's terrible, Vita agreed cheerfully. I'm getting a refill. Harlan's compound buzzed with staff the second they pulled into the drive. The property was well cared for, and the estate looked recently renovated. Where Harlan got the funds for the project, Raden could only guess. Likely not in his pack's best interest. The man who met them at the door was tight-faced. He walked them through the house, pointing them to their guest quarters in the east wing. He showed Vita and Dax to their rooms, then pushed open the double doors on their left. For the Challenger and his mate. A single room with a king-size bed, an armoire and a settee pushed against the far wall. One door into what was presumably a bathroom. Talia stilled beside him. They couldn't argue this. Harlan would have too many questions. Still, Raden felt guilty about being secretly pleased. Talia thanked the man and walked into the room ahead of him without hesitation, but her pulse raced. She swallowed hard. "Looks perfect. We'll be expecting you in the dining hall in 30 minutes, the man said, giving a slight bow. Raden clenched his jaw. Dinner. Exactly what he'd been hoping for after 17 hours of straight foreplay. Right. Perfect. Chapter 20. Talia. The bathroom had served its purpose, which was she'd spent 40 minutes in it without standing face-to-face with Raden Calder. She'd showered, dressed, straightened her hair, and inspected herself in the mirror until she was convinced her body wasn't even close to symmetrical. The dress she wore was the one Vida had brought. Dark green, soft fabric that clung to her hips. She pressed her ear to the door, listening for Raden. When she heard nothing, she braved the bedroom and found it empty. The water on his side of the suite was running, and her wolf lifted her head. Stop it. Talia hurried to the door. She needed to find Gracie before dinner, before the council presentation, before whatever Harlan had arranged for the evening started, and she lost her window entirely. She needed 10 minutes with her sister that had nothing to do with pack politics or challenge proceedings. She was 2 feet from the door when it opened inward, and she stumbled back. Vida slipped inside wearing a deep burgundy gown. Her face lit up. "You look amazing." Talia nodded. "So do you." Vida smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. In seconds, her whole expression collapsed, her eyes shimmering with tears. "I'm sorry. Talia, I'm so sorry." She put out her arms, and Talia pulled her into a hug. "What are you talking about? You shouldn't be in this situation. You shouldn't have to stand in front of your pack, claimed by an alpha who plucked you off the damn registry." The bathroom door opened, and both of them turned. Raden stood in the doorway in a suit that made Talia's jaw drop. Dark charcoal, the jacket hugging his shoulders. His collar was open one button at the throat. He was clean-shaven, his hair pushed back with product that made it shine. "Oh, hey, Vida," he said. "Wow, you clean up nice." She touched Talia's arm as she passed, gave Raden a hug, then hustled to the door. "I'm sorry," she mouthed before exiting to the hall. The door closed, and Talia's lungs forgot how to expand. Raden fiddled with the cuff of his jacket, not meeting her eyes. "Ready?" "Yes," she chirped, running after Vida. It didn't take long for Raden to catch up, but she stayed a step in front of him. Seeing him dressed like that was messing with her head. More than he had in the car, and that was saying something. She needed to be focused tonight, and Raden was the opposite of focus. Thankfully, Gracie was the first person she saw when they found the dining room. She looked deep in conversation with Mikah, but Talia didn't care. She rushed forward, and as soon as Gracie saw her, she turned and met her halfway. Her sister's arms came around her, and Talia pressed her face into her shoulder. She didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. They both knew all of it already. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were misty. "You're okay," Gracie said. Not a question. Talia nodded. Gracie looked over her shoulder, locking on to Raden. "Mikah wants to, I know, kill him. He'll have to get in line behind Silas." Gracie laughed and squeezed her hands once before releasing them. A flash of red caught her eye, and she pulled Vida over for an introduction. Halfway through, she realized how strange it was to be connecting Raden's sister with her own. Talia paused. "I love her," she said, pointing at Vida, hoping Gracie understood the complexity of this situation. Vida clasped her hand. "Please don't judge me by my brother." Gracie laughed. "As long as you don't judge me by my mate." One of them was going to die. Talia shuddered, plucking a caprese skewer off a passing plate. Dinner was impeccably executed. 8 courses served on crystal that caught the candlelight and threw it back in rainbows. Harlan sat at the head with ease, a true performer, as always. Talia had tried to catch a moment with Silas, but they'd barely been able to make eye contact, despite him sitting next to Mikah across from Raden. The 3 of them tossed barbs over chicken carpaccio. "Seems like breeding rates in the north are lower than ours," Mikah said. At least the Omegas are choosing them. Raden flashed a smile. Silas snorted. Lead by example, I always say. The temperature in the room was ice cold when Harlan finally stood and cleared his throat, silencing the chatter. I want to address the challenge structure while we have the relevant parties. He waited for the tables to fully settle. The council has reviewed the right of succession. Gregor Kade was killed in his own territory, and it has recently come to light that this was done by a member of his own bloodline. Harlan paused, a smile on his lips as if what he'd just said wasn't earth-shattering. Talia's head whipped to Gracie, but her expression was just as shocked as hers. Harlan sighed. Right of kill is established under pack law as the first claim on succession. The challenge to the Kade seat rests with the holder of right of kill. He looked, finally, at Silas. Not with Mikah Kade. Gasps sounded around the room, but across from her, Silas sat perfectly still, his eyes hard. He wouldn't look at her. Mikah turned in his chair, grabbing his brother's arm. Is this true? He hissed. Silas refused to answer. Harlan chuckled. It's true. We found DNA proof on the knife used to kill Gregor. Your brother can tell you all about it later. And I will say he did a fine job of leading us off the scent. Silas? Killed Gregor? She'd known it was a possibility, but how? And why hadn't he told her? It couldn't be you, Silas said under his breath, his eyes finally flicking up to hers. Talia's heart sank. Harlan looked at his glass, his expression pleasant. The formal challenge proceeds between Silas Kade and Raden Calder. The council will confirm the structure tomorrow morning. He took a sip of his wine as if he'd just announced a Christmas breakfast. Chapter 21. Raden. The bed was empty when Raden returned to the room. He stood in the doorway long enough to establish this fully, then stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The lamp on the far table was off. The curtains were drawn. The pillow on Talia's side looked unused. He cursed under his breath. She was in the house. He knew this without having to think. But after what happened at dinner, she'd disappeared and he hadn't caught a glimpse of her since. He set his jacket over the chair back and worked the cufflinks out of his sleeves. The council conversations had run later than expected, which was either because the members he'd needed to speak with had been genuinely interested in what he had to say about tomorrow's session, or because Harlan had arranged the evening schedule to ensure that his guests spent as little time as possible in a position to plot. Probably both. Harlan's arrangements tended toward luxury with maximal inconvenience, and he'd had 20 years to perfect the craft. He sat down in the armchair in the corner and put his elbows on his knees, dropping his face in his hands. The challenge was now against Silas, on his territory with a right to kill. He'd spent 3 hours in a back corridor with Dax and 2 council members working through the structural implications of this, and all of them agreed this couldn't be better for him. Silas was strong, yes, but he was emotional, easy to rattle. Better yet, his wolf wasn't a threat, even if he knew Raden's weaknesses. The chance of him successfully triggering a shift when his wolf knew he was weaker was slim. But something didn't sit right with him about that assessment. Silas had killed his own father, and the way he looked at Talia, he gritted his teeth. They had a history, of what nature he couldn't tell. He lifted his face from his hands. He should sleep. The council session was at 9. He needed to be functional, which required lying down in the bed, closing his eyes and not thinking about the fact that the person who was supposed to be in it was somewhere in Harlan's house at, he checked, midnight. Raden stayed in the chair. It wasn't even a question. He was going to sit here until she came back. Chapter 22. Talia. Talia had been in Harlan Voss's personal library for 2 hours before she found what she was looking for. She'd come because the alternative was lying in the dark with Raden, which was not going to help her save his life or Silas's. The library was floor to ceiling, every wall filled to the brim. There was a taxonomy to the arrangement that wasn't alphabetical or by subject in any obvious sense, and it took her the better part of an hour to work out the logic. It was arranged by function, what something did, what it allowed. Harlan had been organizing his library the same way he organized everything else, by what it could accomplish for him. She pulled a slim volume on territorial compact law from 1962 and sat in the chair nearest the lamp with her feet tucked under her. She read 3 chapters, but there was nothing of use. She put it back and pulled a bound council proceeding from the late 80s. More useful, there was a dissenting opinion on right of succession. She built a rough map in her head. Pack law had 3 branches: territorial, which governed land and resource rights; hereditary, which governed bloodline succession; and cooperative, which governed the mechanisms by which packs resolved disputes without combat. Cooperative law was the thinnest branch. It had been the thinnest branch for as long as she could trace because it required the parties to want resolution more than they wanted to win. And most challenges were not brought by parties who wanted to cooperate. She was pulling a 1947 volume of council addenda when she found it. 3 pages in a 40-page addendum tucked inside a broader section on arbitration processes. Pre-challenge conversion to cooperative arbitration, territorial application. She read the first paragraph, then went back and read it again. The clause had been invoked 3 times in recorded council history. The conditions were specific. A sitting challenge could be converted to arbitration if the challenger held an established right rather than a provision filing alone, if the challenged alpha presented a recognized and willing mate bond to the council as evidence of governance stability, and if a cooperative seat agreement was filed by all parties within the challenge window. Her whole body stilled. A shared seat? Was it possible? Silas held right of kill, not a filing. An established right, which was exactly the language of Condition 1. If Silas ceded right of kill to Mikah, and Mikah held the seat by combined right, there wouldn't need to be combat. Raden retained his territory under the new seat. She pressed her finger flat against the page and breathed. Condition 2. The challenged alpha presents a recognized and willing mate bond. Raden was the challenged alpha, but he had no bond. She stared at the clause, jumping when the door opened behind her. She scurried to hide the papers, then stopped. Gracie stood in the doorway in sleep clothes and socks, her dark hair loose. I couldn't sleep either. Talia exhaled. Thank heavens you're here. You need to see this. Gracie crossed the room and pulled the ottoman from beneath the side table and sat close. And for a moment, they were just 2 sisters in a library at 1 a.m. Gracie looked at the open document, reading. Do you think Harlan's lying? No. Talia shook her head. She'd seen Silas's face. He hadn't even tried to defend himself. She still couldn't believe he hadn't told her the truth. The library door opened again. I'm sorry, Vida said. She looked between them, at the lamp, at the papers. I didn't mean to interrupt. Sit down, Gracie said, which was how Talia knew Vida was already theirs. Vida sat on the footstool next to Gracie and read the document, then instantly shook her head. He won't take it. The clock ticked. Why not? Talia held her breath. He promised he wouldn't force you. He promised that? Gracie looked impressed. Talia exhaled. But this wouldn't be... He's my brother. He won't take it. Vida pointed at the text. A recognized and willing mate bond? She blew out a breath. You can try, Talia. I'm not saying you can't, but I've seen the way he looks at you. If he thinks there's a chance this is coerced... She shook her head. Well, we both know he's a stubborn ass. Chapter 23. Talia. This was the only option. Those words rang in her head as Talia slunk through the dark bedroom and shut the bathroom door behind her without latching it. She stood at the sink in the low glow of the nightlight, her heart still running from the library, from Vita's voice saying, I see how he looks at you. What was happening? She'd come here to give Mikah information that would hopefully help him in the fight, and now the tables hadn't only turned, they'd flipped over. Silas killed Gregor. Silas had to challenge. She wasn't only concerned with Silas. Talia brushed her teeth in a trance and took her hair down, setting the clip on the edge of the sink. Even from here, she could feel him. Raden was asleep in the bed, his breathing slow and even. She reached behind her and unzipped the dress, stepped out of it, and draped it over the towel bar. She had no idea where her pajamas were, and she wasn't going to turn on any lights and risk waking him. It took a few seconds to navigate the room, but she found the edge of the bed and slid under the sheets. Carefully, she shifted her legs toward Raden's warmth, but he wasn't there. The bed was empty, which made no sense because the mattress jolted. Raden, it had to be him, pulled on the covers and slid in. Had he been sitting on the chair? She couldn't tell if he was awake or half asleep as he lay next to her, his legs bare. He was a personal heater, and she was going to take full advantage, even if he didn't know it. She closed her eyes, willing her mind to settle, when Raden moved. It was a small movement, an adjustment in sleep, but his hand came to rest against her hip. Light, barely there, the edge of his thumb against the thin fabric of her underwear. She couldn't breathe. And then his thumb moved, a slow arc, against her hip bone and back. Her breath came out in a shaky exhale as his palm lifted and pressed flat against the curve of her hip. Talia turned her head. He was facing her. She couldn't see his eyes in the dark, only the shape of his face, the shadow where his jaw sat. He was awake, but neither of them spoke. She turned onto her side to face him, and his hand slid from her hip to the dip of her waist, resting there, heavy and warm. His thumb traced the edge of her ribcage. Once. She trailed her hand up his arm, never before realizing that the ink under her palm was raised in places. He exhaled, dragging her closer. His forehead dropped to hers, and she tilted her chin up. Raden's mouth found hers in the dark, soft and hesitant. He kissed her once and pulled back, sucking in a breath. His hand moved up her spine, then splayed against her back. She pressed into him, kissing him back, kneading his lips, his skin. She'd fought against this urge every second, and tonight, she was sick of it. Tonight, she wanted to give in, to feel what her wolf had been pushing her toward. But then she remembered the library, condition number 2. She pulled back, hesitated for a second, and Raden's hand stilled immediately. His breath was ragged, his body trembling. She pressed her forehead to his collarbone and breathed. She couldn't do this. Not when she hadn't talked to Silas, and not when she hadn't told Raden the truth. His hand stayed flat against her back, and when she didn't kiss him again, he turned her, just as he had in the training room. His arm came around her waist, his chest pressed warm against her back, his chin finding the space above her head. She put her hand over his. His breathing slowed, and her wolf curled up, content. Talia stared into the dark. She had an option where one of them didn't have to die. She could see the steps, but she had to stop lying to herself about why she was taking them. Raden Calder was her mate. Her wolf had known it from the first moment she stepped foot in the den, had known it on the cliffside after she collapsed in the forest, and knew it in the kitchen at 1 a.m. with his apron and perfect eggs. She couldn't keep fighting it. She was done fighting it. But Vita was right. After what she'd said and done, how would Raden ever believe her? Chapter 24. Talia. Raden was asleep when Talia left to find Silas. She didn't have much time to make this work, and thankfully, she found him in the kitchen at 6 a.m. Silas, like her, didn't sleep well in unfamiliar houses. He was battling with the coffee machine when she walked in. "Well, you look terrible," he said. "Good morning to you, too." "That's not an insult. I'm concerned." He turned back to the machine. "Sit." She sat on a stool at the island. The kitchen was smaller than Harlan's grandiose dining room suggested it should be. It was cozy in warm woods and neutral tile. Almost charming. Silas set a mug in front of her, and she wrapped both hands around it. "How was the room?" he asked. "Fine." "How was the room?" "I heard you the first time, and yet you didn't answer." He raised an eyebrow and took a drink from his mug. "Raden is a gentleman, if that's what you're asking." Silas grimaced. "Not the word I'd use, but okay." She snorted. "Well, I think I'd rather be asking you the questions." Silas's jaw worked. "How did you do it?" "You know how I did it." "Before I got there?" He nodded. Talia's grip tightened on the coffee mug. "You planned it that way?" Why the pretense? He took a long drink. You were just so excited to be a murderer. She scoffed. Do not pretend. I'm not. I'm sorry. Silas held up his hands. I wanted to help you, but when I ran the scenario, He shook his head, drawing a breath. There were very few instances where you didn't get caught. Talia considered this. I don't understand. Harlan had Mikah placed in a cell for Gregor's murder, and here you are, ready to challenge for high alpha? Silas scoffed. Are you surprised? He waited for her to put the pieces together, but when she still looked at him, flummoxed, he spelled it out. Harlan needs a puppet, Tal. He thinks I'll be easier to control than Mikah. And honestly, he's not wrong. Silas? What? It's the truth. Talia searched for something to say, but when nothing came, she nudged the folded papers she tucked into her pocket across the island toward him. Read this. He picked it up, unfolded it, and smoothed the crease with one hand. His eyes moved across the page. Where did you find this? Harlan's library. The corner of his mouth tipped up. Of course you did. He set the papers flat on the counter and pressed one finger to the conditions, reading them a third time. If I cede to Mikah, combined right, blood and kill, he holds the seat jointly with Raden, without combat. And Calder keeps his territory? Under the new seat, yes. Silas was quiet. And Harlan? Right. Harlan Voss would be demoted, working under 2 councils and 2 alphas. Silas immediately understood. Tell me about him. Silas leaned over the counter. Harlan? You know better than... Calder, Talia. Don't dodge. You saw the conditions and I know you understand what they mean. She'd known as soon as he read the second condition that this was coming. She'd been deciding since the library, since she'd lain awake in the dark with Raden's arms around her, how much she would tell Silas. It turned out the answer was easy. Everything. Chapter 25. Raden. Raden had been at the window for an hour when she knocked. Waking to find the bed empty had nearly sent him into a spiral. Somehow she'd known and left him a note. He twirled the paper in his hand, turning to find her in the doorway. I need to talk to you. She walked in, weathered papers in her hand. He nodded and stepped back from the window, his eyes glazing over at the way she looked in her tank top and cotton pants. The light hit the side of her face as she set the papers on the small table by the armoire and smoothed them flat. I talked to Silas this morning, she started, but he held up a hand. He needed to touch her. Come here, he murmured, and Talia's cheeks flushed pink. Please. Talia walked to him, standing close enough that her breath warmed his shoulder. He lifted a hand, running his knuckles over her cheekbone. Continue. Her eyes fluttered closed. I talked with Silas this morning. With? Or to? She flicked him, her brow furrowing. Stop interrupting. He cupped her jaw, running his thumb over her lower lip. Right, I'm sorry. She drew in a breath. I told him about you. Everything, Raden. I'm not going to pretend you're going to be okay with that, but I needed him to understand who you are before I showed him these. Talia turned her head and nodded to the papers. His hands stilled. She looked up at him through her lashes. Read them, please. The frequency running through his chest lifted to a buzz. He understood what she'd done. She had taken the most private pieces of him, the ones he'd kept managed and contained and out of sight, and she'd laid them in front of a Kade in order to build a case. For what? She'd given his vulnerabilities to the man who had the right to kill him? But then she'd come back to him. He nudged her toward the table. Show me. She walked him through it, explaining what Silas ceding his right to kill would accomplish, how Raden would share the high alpha seat with Mikah, how Harlan would lose much of his power, and they could work toward dismantling the registry. Silas doesn't want to be alpha. He never wanted that. It isn't... Raden held up a hand. All of this sounded too perfect to be true. So why was she trying so hard to convince him? What does it require? He asked. She wet her lips and swallowed hard, then pointed at the paragraphs containing the conditions. He didn't look down. Say it. Her eyes flickered. Then she set her jaw and recited. A recognized and willing mate bond, presented to the council as evidence of governance stability. She kept her eyes on his. From you. The room was quiet, and all he could hear was Talia's beating heart. This was her solution. The provision existed, the path where no one went onto the challenge field. He and Silas stayed alive, Mikah holding the seat by a right Harlan couldn't contest. The whole architecture of what Harlan had been building for 11 years collapsed at its foundation. And all that was required was the bond he had wanted since she'd stood across his desk, wet from the rain. We need to start being cooperative, Raden. That's what you want, isn't it? It's what we both want. Talia's eyes were pleading. It would require zero sacrifice. Easy. Everyone would win. I won't do it. He pushed back from the table. I know. That's why I'm standing here asking you to let me choose. Talia. You promised you wouldn't force me, and you haven't. This is me standing in front of you, telling you that I want this, that I'm choosing it. You're choosing it because my life and your friend's life are on the table. I'm choosing it because you would not be here, he said. If either of us wasn't facing a challenge field, you would not be standing in this room asking for a bond if this provision didn't also happen to save our lives. He heard the flatness in his own voice and couldn't do anything about it. That's not a choice. That's a rescue, and you are not here to rescue me. Her jaw tightened. Don't tell me what I'm choosing. I'm not. Choose it all you want. I'm simply telling you what I can't take. He held her gaze. She stared at him, her hands fisted at her sides. Her eyes went glassy and something inside of him cracked. Raden reached out a hand, but she flinched back. Not like this, he whispered. Not with my death as the alternative. Not when you'd spend the next decade wondering whether you chose me or whether you chose to save me. And I'd spend the next decade not knowing and not being able to ask. His chest refused to expand. I can't do that to you. To us. Don't ask me to. Raden. Her voice cracked. I'm telling you, I want this. I'm telling you, it's real. You have to. I believe you. She stopped. I believe you want it, he said. That's the problem. Her eyes were bright. She made a sound in her throat, her hand pressing to her mouth, and he couldn't watch. He turned to the door, stopping only at the sound of her voice. Raden, one of you will die. I can't. I know, he whispered. And that's the problem. He left before he heard her break. Chapter 26. Talia. Her body awoke in stages, and none of them felt good. Eyes swollen to slits, head a dull, pressurized ache behind both temples. She'd cried herself empty somewhere around 2 a.m, and now the sunlight pressed against her closed lids with cheerful indifference. She reached across the bed without thinking. Cold sheets. Empty. Talia's eyes shot open. Hey, you. Gracie sat in the armchair. She was already dressed, her dark hair pinned back, her hands folded in her lap. Morning. Talia pushed herself up to sitting and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. Where is he? Gracie's pause was a half-second too long. Talia lowered her hands. Gracie, where is Raden? He's... Her sister stopped. He left. The room was very still. What? That's... Talia's mouth wouldn't close properly. He left? Gracie's lip wobbled. He released the claim, Talia. Met with Harlan this morning. She heard the words. They arrived in order, and she understood them individually, but together they made no sense. It wasn't pain, exactly. No, it was something more comprehensive than that. An absence. A hollow. A severed beam that had once been load-bearing. He released the claim. The comprehensiveness of it hit her like ice-cold water. Hey, Gracie was off the chair, across the room, sitting on the edge of the bed. Her hand found Talia's. "Hey, it's done. You're free, okay? I know you were hoping he'd take it, but Silas will be okay. We can—" Her brow furrowed as she watched Talia's face. Talia's throat closed. "Oh," Gracie said softly. "Don't," Talia managed. "Don't say it like that." "Like what? Like—" She choked back a sob. "Talia?" Gracie's hand tightened around hers. "I've known you your entire life. I knew there was something there, but I didn't realize—" The ache in her chest became a throat punch. "He wouldn't take it," she croaked. Gracie pulled her in. Her sister's arms came around her and she went without resistance, pressing her face into Gracie's shoulder, and she cried, feeling the full weight of it. "He's right," she whispered. "Everything he said was right, except—" She swiped at her nose, sitting up to look Gracie in the eye. "It was both. I wanted to save his life, but I would have wanted the bond anyway, and now I've lost both. No." Gracie straightened her shoulders. "Go to the council session." "What?" "Now! Get ready and go. Present the provision, and then you figure out the rest." She brushed the tears from Talia's cheeks with her thumbs. "You found the clause. You built the argument. Silas has the provision, and he knows what it means. You don't have to have the whole thing solved." "But the bond—" "Just go! It's in an hour." Talia blinked, then nodded. "I need to wash my face." "You do. And eat something?" "Mm-hmm." Gracie patted her cheek. "See you there." Chapter 27. Raden. Dax hit him on the left side and he went down. It was barely a check to the shoulder that caught him off balance, but it sent him to the mat. "Where are your feet?" Dax growled. Raden didn't particularly care. He lay there on the mat, catching another breath of her scent. If Dax knew why he wanted to spar in the center of the room, he hadn't let on. "You're dropping your right," Dax said. "I know. You've been dropping it for 20 minutes. I know." He paused, his hands on his hips. "Do you want to stop?" Raden breathed, his ribs aching. "No." He wouldn't leave this room until Dax carried him out. He pushed up to his knees. 3 days. The challenge was in 3 days on his territory, on ground he'd chosen and prepared and knew better than Silas Kade. He had every advantage. He should have been celebrating. Instead, he was questioning his damn decision every second of the day. He'd grown up seeing how alphas worked, watching men like Gregor Cade take what they wanted and call it a right. He'd spent his life working to undo that alpha legacy, and he wouldn't rebuild it in a room in Harlan's house because Talia was willing and the provision existed. He'd made the choice and now he had to live with it, regardless of the cost. The cost at present was that he couldn't block his left side, and he was lying on a training mat at 7 a.m, hoping for a hint of her scent. There were worse things. There had to be worse things. Raden stood and brushed himself off. Again. Chapter 28. Talia. The council met in Harlan's East receiving room, paneled in dark oak floor to ceiling. 7 council members sat at the long table, the light from the tall windows making them look like gods. Talia came in with her notes and took a seat. The ache in her chest had only grown since she woke, but she could wait to break apart until after the meeting. She placed her notes on the table, then looked up and froze. What the hell? Vita stood beside Silas. Why would she still be there without her brother? And why was she next to Silas? Not in the observer's row along the wall. Not behind him. Beside him. Did they even know each other? Talia stared at Silas, trying to catch his attention. By the heavy swallow in his throat, she knew he felt her gaze, but he refused to look. "Miss Whitlock." The council chair, Garin, turned toward her, his back straight. "You're listed as a petitioner today?" "I am." Her voice somehow stayed level. "I'll be addressing the governance stability condition in the—" the stability condition has been met. I'm assuming you're referring to the cessation?" He folded his hands on the table. Talia stared at him with wide eyes. How did he know about that? Had Gracie arrived early? Yes, Silas. The council voted at 8 this morning on a petition submitted late last night. I can summarize the outcome, or you can speak with the petitioner directly. He turned and nodded at Vida. Vida met her eyes and winked. What the hell was happening? What petitioner? Talia asked, her voice low as Vida walked toward her. She gave an apologetic smile, her eyes pleading. I submitted a bond filing, and it was completed before the council opened session. Silas Kade and I are bonded, under cooperative governance terms. The joining of our territories constitutes demonstrated governance stability under the cooperative governance provision. The council had a quorum. They voted. Blood rushed in Talia's ears. Her eyes snapped between the two of them. You? Bonded Silas? Yes. She looked at him, his face a mask of calm. The provision required proof of governance stability. Raden had refused the bond that would have constituted that proof. But Vida had known just as she did that this challenge could take his life. One of them would die. Vida had found a loophole. She looked at the problem and found the single thing they'd missed. It didn't have to be Raden's bond. Yes, it specified the challenger, but if the goal was stability, then this accomplished it. A voluntary union under governance terms, 2 territories joined. Vida had given herself to Silas for her brother. And Silas... Talia's eyes pricked. Silas, who'd met her each day to teach her how to hold a knife, who was never acknowledged by his father but still worked for the good of the pack, who protected her at every turn, even when it meant risking his own freedom. Silas gave himself to Vida to save his brother, and in so doing, had saved her sister Gracie, too. You didn't have to. Talia stopped, her throat closing. She couldn't finish the sentence because she knew they were right. It was the only option, one she hadn't even thought of. It's done, Vida whispered, winking. Silas turned to the council and spoke. I formally cede right of kill succession to Mikah Kade. By blood right and transferred kill rights, he holds the High Alpha seat. He didn't look at Harlan. The challenge filed for this territory is moot. Garen made a note. Talia looked at Harlan. He sat very still, his hands flat on the table. The whole thing took less time than the stakes warranted. 3 sentences from Garen, the formal record updated, Harlan's petition struck from the current session's agenda, Raden's territory secured under the new holding, no grounds for further challenge, no gap remaining for anyone to fill. Done. Talia stared as the council members milled around her. Talia? Vida's voice sounded next to her. Look at me. She looked up. He flew back to the estate, Vida said. 3 days to the challenge. He'll be in the training room or he'll be in the woods, and either way he won't be sleeping. I asked that the council delay communication. She held Talia's gaze. He doesn't know I was here. He doesn't know what Silas and I filed. I didn't ask his permission because you know what he would have said. Talia nodded. He needs to hear this from someone he trusts, not in an email. If I go, he'll spend those 10 minutes arguing about whether I was allowed to do this, and he'll miss the part where it's over and done. Her chin tilted. Go? For me? Anything. She pulled Vida into a hug, then gathered her papers and ran. Chapter 29. Raden. They'd only arrived home last night, and he'd already lost track of his training sessions. One blended into the next, leaving room only for sleep and meals when he could stomach it. Tonight, they'd stopped briefly for dinner and then returned to the gym. He hadn't outright admitted it, but this was the only thing keeping his wolf from fully taking over. Raden wanted to let him. Wanted to hide at the back of his mind and let him run free. But his wolf felt everything more strongly than he did. His shifts used to knock him flat. Now, they knocked him out. But the challenge was in 3 days, and his unraveling had a rapidly decreasing half-life. At least if he couldn't hold it together, the pain wouldn't last much longer. Dax dropped his hands after another round of bag work. That's enough for today. Raden brought his up. We're not done. You need to stop. Dax stepped back, refusing to participate. You've been on this mat since 7 this morning. Whatever you're trying to fix, you're not fixing it. Raden started to hyperventilate. His shoulder ached, his hands were swollen, but he couldn't locate the part of himself that cared enough to stop. He dropped his head. Again. Raden, I'm not asking you to carry me. Set your feet or step off. Dax held his gaze for a long moment. Then, he stepped off. Raden waited until he left to drop to his knees. That night, after forcing food down his throat, Raden sat in the den with the challenge terms on his laptop. He reviewed the boundary documentation again to make sure it was correct. He'd run this route so many times. The knowledge of the trails lived in his muscles as much as his mind. Tomorrow, he would see her. The thought rolled through his head like a marble, slowing, then speeding up at any moment. He hadn't shifted since the last time with her, which was either a good sign or a terrible one. What would his wolf do the next time she was in front of him? She was no longer his claim, but his wolf wouldn't forget as quickly as the registry records did. Raden went to the window. The trees ran down from the cliff in the last of the light, darkening at their edges. In 16 hours, he'd be at the east clearing. He'd be standing on the ground he'd prepared, looking at Silas Kade. But all points of interest led to Talia. Tomorrow, he'd see her face, know she was all right. It was something. Under the circumstances, it was everything he had. He stood at the window until the last of the light drained from the sky, then stared into the darkness a little longer. The thought of retreating to his room felt like torture. Night was the worst. After holding her until morning, even for just one night, his arms and his bed felt hollow. As he considered going back to the training room, 3 knocks sounded at the door. What? He snapped, prepping for another lecture from Dax. The man was loyal to a fault, and every once in a while he wished he'd give up on him. It would make self-destructing a hell of a lot easier. The door swung inward, but it wasn't Dax who entered. Raden's heart lodged in his throat. Talia stood in the doorway, her hair wet from the rain. Had it started raining? Hi. She took a tentative step toward him, and his eyes dropped, searching for whatever she may have carried with her. All she had was a purse. Raden didn't move. He couldn't. Part of him wondered if this was his final break, if he'd shifted without realizing it and was living in one of his sigh memories. She glanced at the chair, and he wondered if she'd ask to sit. But instead, she straightened her shoulders. The challenge is cancelled. I came to tell you. What? He barked. Was that the only reason she was here? To talk about his challenge with Silas? If so, Raden Calder, sit your ass down. She crossed her arms over her chest. I have something to talk to you about, and I need your full attention. She took another step into the room, and his wolf stood at attention. Can you manage that? Chapter 30. Talia. Yeah, I can. Raden's eyes locked on hers as he dropped into his chair. It felt like 1,000 years since she'd been here, even though it was really just days. That probably had something to do with driving hours to the closest airport with a flight to Seattle, then wasting half the day in the terminal because there was a mechanical issue with the plane. It probably would have been faster to drive. But now she was here, and this scene was exactly as she remembered it. Bookshelves, the carved desk, and Raden's figure silhouetted in the dark. This time his shoulders slumped and his knuckles were swollen. The skin split over the right one. His wolf prowled on the surface in a way she'd only seen twice. The first time he'd been in her bedroom. If only she'd known then what she knew now. Talia walked to the desk and stood in front of him, reveling at the way he looked up at her through his lashes. The challenge is off, she repeated. Silas ceded his right of kill to Mikah this morning. Mikah now holds the high alpha seat shared with you. She watched his face for any recognition of what she was telling him. A muscle in his jaw ticked. How? This was the part she'd been dreading. I showed you the requirements. He nodded, the skin around his eyes creasing as he braced himself for bad news. She wasn't good at hiding her apprehension. I wasn't the only one who wanted to save you, she said, and it turns out the Cades are rather attached to Mikah. Raden's breathing quickened. Talia? Vita. She submitted a voluntary bond to Silas, joining the 2 territories, and Vita said she would drive home. Talia nodded. She lied. Having you gone was the only way she'd be able to make it work. If you were there, you would have stopped it."
"Hell yes, I would have."
He turned away from her. One sharp movement toward the window, both hands spreading flat on the sill. His shoulders rose and dropped.
"She doesn't even know him."
"No, but I do."
"Vita called me. This morning she called me and we talked for 20 minutes and she didn't say."
He stopped. His hands pressed harder against the stained wood. "I know," she said. "Silas didn't tell me either." "Tell me about him." That's what Silas had asked of her before he went through with the bond. "Vita did this for you. Silas did it for his brother, but—"
"But what?"
Raden turned back, his eyes searching her face. "He also did it for me." Talia's throat grew thick. Letting Mikah go would have been difficult for Silas, but he didn't speak with Mikah every day. He didn't train with him for hours or walk through the woods with him, talking about all his wild thoughts. That was what she and Silas did together. Since she'd been gone, he had nobody. The room went quiet, and she let Raden sit in it. She'd already worked through this with Gracie, then had the flight and drive to the house to let the reality of it settle. After a few minutes, she said, "I'd offer to spar with you, but it looks like you've already done enough of that with Dax." Raden coughed a laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Raden." He turned to look at her.
"Is there more?"
She nodded, shifting her weight. "You have what you wanted. You and Mikah share the high alpha seat, and neither of your lives are in imminent danger. My claim was released as you requested, and both our registry records have been updated, so there's no external motivator, no legal instrument, and no provision outstanding that requires me to be here." She held his gaze, watching her words sink in. Raden's breathing slowed, his pupils dilating. "Raden, if you don't—" He launched himself over the desk, sending his pens, papers, and laptop skittering onto the floor. "Raden!" His hands were on her face, her neck, his body flush against hers as he curled to look into her eyes.
"You're here."
She nodded, and his eyes scanned her face like she'd disappear at any second.
"Is this real?"
he murmured, and she ran her hands up his spine. "It's real." He laughed with relief.
"I don't always know."
"I know." She smiled up at him, her fingertips pressing into the taut muscles, overworked and tense. He bent low, curling his hands under her thighs and lifting her up to his level. His hands trembled against her skin.
"What do you want from me, Talia?"
Talia's eyes dropped to his lips, flushed and full. She dragged a finger across them, watching his eyes roll into his head. "You know what I want."
"I know what I hope you want. I know what I've thought about every day since driving home, wishing I could rewind and—"
"No." She caught his face in her hands. "That's why I'm here, Raden. Don't you understand? My whole life I was only useful, only valuable for what I offered the pack. Whether I could breed or catch the eye of a powerful alpha, I was always leverage, and when you brought me here—"
"I was the one who used you."
She nodded, swallowing hard. "But then you didn't. When you had the choice to use me for exactly the purpose of my claim, you didn't." Raden dropped his eyes, but she forced them back up. "That's why I'm here. The fact that you didn't sign your Omegas up for the registry was why I offered in the first place. And then you could have saved your life. But even when I asked to be your leverage, you wouldn't take it." She dropped her walls, opening her heart and mind to him as best she knew how. "Bond me, Raden. That's what I want from you." His breathing quickened, his hands flexing against her waist. Every exhale drew him closer, luring him to her mouth. "Unless there's some other reason you'd like to reject me?" He let out a ragged laugh, his lips hovering over hers.
"I didn't reject you."
She grinned. "It was a joke."
"Not funny."
He caught her lip with his and let it go, teasing her as punishment. "I'm sorry." She watched his mouth, willing him to try that again.
"How sorry?"
He pulled her hips closer, the waistband of his pants pressing against her inner thighs. She gripped his shoulders, begging with every inch of her body for him to kiss her. A feral gasp ripped from his throat as he finally closed his mouth over hers, the anguish of the last few days being exorcised. She absorbed it. drew it out like poison until his skin flushed, heat roaring through him like it had after his shift.
Talia, I can't control this,
he gasped, turning to sit on the desk and pulling her into his lap. He dragged her knees tight against his hips and thighs, gripping her waist and pressing her down against him.
I can't.
Let go. She curled her fingers in his hair, pleasure rolling through her as his arms and hands enveloped her, rooting her in his strength, his solidity. When an alpha comes apart, you can't reach the man until you've settled the wolf. Talia pressed her hands to either side of his face, forcing him to look at her. His pupils were blown wide, sweat beading on his brow. You won't hurt me.
You don't know that.
She gripped him harder, rolling her hips against his and holding him tight. I've watched you fight this, watched you run and hide, watched you suffer because you're trying to control this.
But the elders say...
To hell with what the elders say. The elders also say we have a breeding crisis, an alpha crisis, and a negative flow of shifter energy. You could be the solution to this, Raden, not the problem.
And if I'm not? If I do what you say, if I stop fighting this and I become something dangerous, what then? Will you be the one to keep our pack safe?
Our pack. The words sent a shiver down her spine. Raden tried to look away, but she moved with him. Eyes on me. His face twisted with fear, and she kissed him, her tongue sweeping against his. Yes, she whispered. If that was what he needed to know, it was an easy promise. If you become a danger to our pack, I'll take you out. She kissed him again.
I'll make it fast.
Raden responded, tipping her head up and devouring her throat. I'll do it in your sleep, or... Her breath caught as his hand slid up her stomach.
Don't stop,
he breathed. I'd slip too much monkshood into your tea, or crush some dried water hemlock into your jar of jam.
That's very specific.
Raden fumbled with her shirt, yanking it up her back. Talia curled, allowing him to slip it over her head, then tore his off in return, tossing it on the floor. Well, give me more time, and I'll come up with an even better option. Light from the exterior fixtures lit his skin in gold, and Talia pressed her hands to his chest. He flinched against the cold, and she dropped her mouth to his tightening skin. Raden couldn't handle it. He flipped her onto the desk, pressing her down like he had her on the mats, stretching his body over hers. Was this why his desk was so large, so it could hold his weight? She must have said it out loud because Raden answered,
Only one way to find out.
He pushed the rest of his things onto the floor, grabbed both her wrists with one hand and turned her, dragging her body lengthwise. Then he tore off his pants and climbed onto the desk with her. Talia shimmied out of her slacks, pulling her knees up to slide them off her ankles, and as soon as they were free, Raden was there, lifting her bottom half onto his knees, his long arms still giving him plenty of reach. He mapped her body like he planned to be tested on the content, moving her into the light, studying her with his eyes, lips, tongue, and hands. When his body writhed like a dog waiting for a treat, he tore open his desk drawer and found a pair of scissors.
Hold still.
She gasped at the cold metal against her skin, but in less than a second, her underwear was gone, and he was there. All of him, stretching over her, locking her to the wood. Energy built between them like pressure before a storm. He hummed with it, colors flashing in her head, chaos and madness, his body pure power above her. Let go. She willed the words between them, and in seconds, the clouds burst. Raden's thoughts flooded her head, flowing through her like water, lighting up every pleasure center in her brain and body. He was everywhere. His hands, his mouth, his mind. He was light and heat, his hips thrusting against hers as every nerve in her body tingled, then fluttered, then burned. He heard her need before she thought it, landing exactly where she yearned for touch. He teased out whimpers and breaths, drawing out his own pleasure to bring her with him. Talia cried out in pure ecstasy, her body transcending the physical as Raden settled into a rhythm, working her to a peak she never dreamed possible. Her wolf tore through her, tangling with his, desperate and wild until he pinned her flat, burying her in dark, black fur. Raden bellowed as they both tumbled over the edge, gathering her into his chest. His hand braced against her lower back as he pushed deeper. She clung to him, her arms weak, her head curled against his slick skin. She couldn't speak. could barely breathe, as Raden's mind calmed, bathing her in wave after wave of warmth and soft, glowing light. Talia's arms went slack, her body supported only by Raden's. He flopped to his side and pulled her close, then rolled her on top of him, allowing her to sunbathe like a lizard on a rock, as both of them floated back to earth. Eventually, Raden's breathing slowed, his fingers stroking the backs of her thighs as she rose and fell with his chest. "Are you okay?" he murmured. She wanted to laugh, but could barely muster the strength to say, "Mm-hmm." She lifted one hand, dropping it to his cheek. "Are you?" His chest stuttered, one hand lifting to her hair, tugging until their eyes met. "If you ever ask me that," he sucked in a breath. "After what just happened?" "You'll what?" A lazy grin spread across her face. "Make me do it again?" Raden's lips curved, and he pulled her up his body until her chin rested on his chest. "I've been so scared." "I know." "I thought if I gave in, I'd—" His face twisted. He took a moment to collect himself. "Talia, I've never felt so whole." She swept a finger over his jaw. "See? Not dangerous." Well, that wasn't exactly true. He'd almost stopped her heart multiple times. "Thank you." He gathered her fingers in his hand and kissed them. "Take me to bed, Raden Calder." Every time she closed her eyes, she dreamed of the way he held her. She never wanted to spend another night without his arms wrapped around her. Raden nudged her. "You'll have to move if you want me to get off this desk." She sighed, nestling into him. "I think you'll figure something out." Epilogue. Silas. The lobby was emptying. Harlan's staff moved through the mass checkout with impressive efficiency, clearing glasses, folding linens, and stripping sheets. Silas stood near the window with his hands in his pockets and watched the last council member disappear through the main doors and duck his head into a black sedan. His shoulders were still tight, even though he should have only felt relief. But that wasn't the right word for what settled in his chest. Relief would have been entering the challenge with Raden and making a misstep, feeling Raden's claws tear through his throat, losing consciousness as his blood finally drained from his body for the last time. "She's gone." Vita walked up and stopped next to him. He nodded. "Good." "Did you say goodbye?" Silas didn't answer. He'd wanted to find Talia before she caught her ride, of course he did, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. The whole time she'd been at the Calder estate, he'd imagined a time when she'd return, when they'd go back to training and bitching about his family, when their lives could go back to normal. But then he'd seen the look in her eyes when she explained the provision she found, and he knew right then that what they'd had was over. Not that he ever thought they'd form a bond, it wasn't like that between them. Talia was his best friend. Now he was back to living in the Kade home alone. Invisible. He flinched when Vita touched his arm, and she pulled her hand back. "Are you okay? Is there anything I can—" "No." His tone wasn't unkind, but he didn't know how to talk to this woman he'd barely met. She smiled too much. It made him nervous. "It's funny." Vita dropped her eyes, fiddling with the hem of her shirt. "We've claimed each other, but I don't know how you take your coffee, or if you even drink coffee, or which side of the bed you sleep on. Not that I'm thinking about sleeping next to you, but—" She blew out a breath. "It's funny, right?" Silas nodded, not at all sure what to say to that, especially when the light caught her hair and made it glow red. "So," Vita clasped her hands behind her back, "where do we go now?" Silas frowned. He'd assumed she'd return to Raden's estate. He'd assumed he'd return north to his territory. He'd assumed, he realized, a great deal about what happened after the session, and all of it, he realized now, was almost certainly wrong. "I don't know." He cleared his throat, tugging at his collar. Was the heat on? This room felt unbearably stuffy. Vita tilted her head, looking at him. "We could go to my place," she said, and Silas frowned. "I thought you said it was a 17-hour... "No." She laughed, her hand landing on his shoulder. The touch sent a jolt down his arm, tingling at his fingertips. "That's what you say. To me. Silas couldn't decide if he wanted to run or do exactly as she told him for the rest of his life. Was she serious? Do you want to come to my place? He'd never once uttered those words to an Omega. Talia had been the one to start their training sessions, and they most certainly hadn't happened on the Kade estate. Vida grinned. Wow, I'd love to. I'm so glad you asked. Epilogue number 2. Varric. Mikah found him in the East Corridor 20 minutes after the council session closed. Varric had the folder ready because he'd basically been Micah's beta for 6 years, and he knew what Mikah needed before Mikah knew he needed it. This was not a skill he'd been born with, it was a skill he'd built, trying to keep all of them out of Gregor's warpath. Tell me, Mikah said. Harlan spoke to 3 council members individually before the vote. Varric opened the folder. Wren, Castillo, and Dumas. All 3 voted against the provision. The 4th, Nakamura, voted with Silas. Michael looked at the names, his jaw working. He knew the clause was coming. Had to. He was in position before Vida submitted. Varric turned to the second page. There's something else. Harlan left the estate at 2 a.m. last Tuesday. His car went north. Not toward any pack territory we track. Human contact? That's the question. He closed the folder and held it out. He's not done, Mikah. The seat was one door, he'll find another. Mikah took the folder and read for a long moment without speaking. When he looked up, his expression was the one Varric loved more than any other. The reason he stayed with Mikah despite the mess their father had made. Mikah was an alpha smart enough to see patterns and hope he was wrong. Men who hoped to be wrong made better decisions than men who needed to be right. Keep watching him, Mikah said. Varric was already on it. The restructuring vote is in 30 days. If Harlan gets Nakamura back, he won't, Mikah said. He handed the folder back. She knows what she voted for today. She'll hold. Varric took the folder. He didn't say what he was thinking, which was that Mikah was about to have to run his thoughts and plans past another alpha, Raden Calder. Congratulations, he said instead. On the seat. Mikah tapped the folder. Good. At least he was thinking about Raden too. Varric stepped back. Gracie's in the East sitting room. She's been there for 2 hours. I know. She's pretending to read something she picked up in Harlan's library but hasn't turned a page in 40 minutes. Micah's expression softened. Varric? This is enough for today, Varric said. Go find your mate. Mikah clapped him on the shoulder and Varric watched him go. Then he opened the folder to the second page and began to read. Epilogue 3. Alec. The facility was quiet at this hour, which meant it was the only time Alec could sleep. He hadn't heard from anyone back home in weeks, but he knew his room was 72 degrees. His therapist's name was Dr. Renner, and she had brown eyes. 3 days ago, he'd managed to sit with his back to a door without having a panic attack. It was the small things. He was a grown man learning, from the beginning, what it meant to have a body that belonged to him. He felt like a child. And after the power pumped through his veins for months, it was a disturbing juxtaposition. Alex stared at his phone on the nightstand. When had he last turned it on? He chuckled to himself. Maybe that was why nobody had called. A knock sounded at the door. Alec. He looked up to find an older Omega standing at his door. Time for meditation, if you're ready. Alec nodded and pushed up from the bed. Meditation was the most difficult part of his day, which meant he had to do it. He drew a deep breath and followed the woman down the hall to the patio door, praying that when he closed his eyes, he didn't see his father. Epilogue 4. Harlan. The restaurant was in a city that had no pack presence, one of his favorites. Elliot sat across from him with a glass of wine he wasn't drinking, even though he pretended to lift his lips. Humans often forgot how sharp shifter senses were, but Elliot liked his games, and Harlan would humor him. It was why he pretended not to know that Elliot and Mikah still spoke weekly. The landscape has changed, Harlan said. I heard. Elliot spun the glass on the table. New seat? New alliance? You lost? Huh. Harlan settled back in his chair. The registry still runs. The council vote on restructuring is in 30 days, and I have 3 members. Nakamura flipped once. She can flip again with the right pressure on the border disputes. Mikah Kade is a new alpha with a new seat and 17 years of territorial obligations that will occupy him for the next decade. He paused. Oh, and he has to cooperate with Raden Calder. Amos Calder's son? Harlan nodded, tapping his fingers on the table. And the humans who are receiving information through Gregor's channels are not receiving anymore. Haven't been for 8 months. I'm told the disruption has been significant. Elliot nodded once but didn't respond. He did like his little games. I have more time on my hands, Harlan said. Different structure, better insulation, no record connecting it to our council. The new seat is an advantage, not a liability. Mikah Kade's attention will be on consolidation, not oversight. He won't know what he's not looking for. He lifted his own glass. All I need is a little time. He took a drink and laughed. Oh, and money. But you already knew that. Elliot was quiet for a long moment. The name's on the list, he said finally. How current? Harlan reached into his jacket and slid a folded paper across the white tablecloth. Elliot opened it and read, then dropped the corner of the paper and took a real drink from his wine glass. There you go. 30 days is manageable, he said. Harlan smiled and took another sip. Outside the restaurant, the city moved in its ordinary human way, entirely unaware of the registry, the Omegas, the pack law, or the machinery that fueled every one of their favorite things. 400 miles west, Mikah Kade was likely celebrating in a room full of people who believed the hard part was behind them. Harlan found he was not angry about the events of that morning. Not in the least. He set his glass down and signaled for the waiter to bring over a dessert menu. He'd always done his best work. From behind. We hope you enjoyed this production of Rebel's Oath, Book 2 in the Brothers Cade series, written by Luna M. Rose and read for you by Cynthia Gunderson. Copyright 2026, Button Press.